All right, hi, hello. We don't have time for introductions. We don't have time for any of that. This video is going to be long. We got to get into it right away. Today, we are going to discuss Prince Harry's autobiography, memoir, that's the word. Today, we're going to discuss Prince Harry's memoir, Spare. It is already big news. It is one of the top-selling nonfiction books ever in the United Kingdom. It is all over the place, not necessarily accurately, but it is all over the media. And since my second video about racism is going to take forever to make, I want to get out my thoughts about Spare in this own self-contained video that hopefully won't take me ages and ages to edit. So before we get into spoilers, let's talk about my overall thoughts about the memoir. Overall, I thought that Spare was very well written. It is, of course, not just written by Harry, it is also ghost-written. That does not detract from the fact that it is Harry's story or say that's not a slight against the book. It's just true. It is a team effort by Prince Harry and J.R. Mooringer. J.R. Mooringer, he's like a Pulitzer Prize writer. But anyway, the book is very thoughtful and it's very well written overall. I would say that it is very sort of lyrical. It's not written in a very sort of journalistic, very like, here are the hard facts sort of way. It interweaves that sort of playfulness of language. It's written in a specific voice. It's written with the perspective of Harry at the time that he's telling these specific stories. It includes his thought process during those particular moments. And I think that is really expertly weaved in with some of his reflections and some of his thinking in hindsight as he's recounting these experiences. And there are some parts of it that are, in some ways, very thoughtful descriptions of some of the horrible realities of just being a human being on this planet. So some parts of it are in some ways very relatable. The sort of emotions that he's describing, the thoughts that he describes, they really pull you into the human aspect of the story. It is not meant to be a dry biography of Harry describing his life. It is truly meant to be like a memoir. It incorporates the creative writing aspect as well as describing events, describing the specifics of the situations. It reminded me a lot of another memoir that I read last year that was amazing, which is Jennette McCurdy's book, I'm Glad My Mom Died. I think both are very similar in that both focus on childhood trauma and also have this aspect about children performing in the public eye or being in the public eye, being in the spotlight. I think both Jennette McCurdy and Prince Harry really focus on the way in which child performance can be abusive, because you are putting a child onto a platform in which the media opens up that child to worldwide criticism, worldwide speculation, worldwide analysis that can be damaging to that child. And both really focus on that idea of consent for children. Can children truly consent to being in the public spotlight, and how can children be within a world in which they are on a public stage and get the mental health support that they need and reconcile and fully comprehend the mental health challenges that come with being publicly scrutinized. Both also give a glimpse into the thought processes of the character within the memoir in those particular moments, having those particular experiences. And they both look back on those experiences with the perspective, with the lens of somebody that has done a lot of therapy and reflection. So that's one aspect of Jennette McCurdy's book that I really loved, is that you can definitely see that she's put in the work to fully wrap her mind around her traumas, her abusive relationships, obviously, especially with her mom, because it's called I'm Glad My Mom Died, and talking about that love for her mom and the feeling, the positive feelings and the positive associations that she had with her mom, while also recognizing the abuse, also recognizing the trauma or the ways in which her mom mistreated her. And you can tell clearly from the book that that comes from a lot of therapy and a lot of reflection and a lot of looking back and analyzing it from an emotional perspective and trying to heal from those moments. I think Spare does that very similarly. It focuses on those experiences, on those events with honesty, but also looking back at it through the perspective of healing. And of course, both books are brutally honest, devastatingly honest, don't shy away from the cold hard facts, the cold hard truths, and some really personal, private truths, but are included within the story because they created the person that you see today. And in Harry's case, there's lots of private moments, there's lots of things that might be embarrassing, but they've made him who he is today, and he's not going to shy away from them. He's going to own them. And so I guess at the end of the day, I'm just saying, go read I'm Glad My Mom Died and go read Spare, because I would recommend both of them. I think both memoirs are really, really well written. Another thing I would mention before we get into spoiler territory is that many revelations from the book are taken wildly out of context. I really recommend forming an opinion on the book after you read the book and not based on any of the sort of clickbaity titles, not focused on the most shocking revelations from Spare or the random excerpts that have appeared either in leaks before the book was published or afterwards. The excerpts I've seen discussed in the media are very, very often taken wildly out of context and have a lot more nuance surrounding the quotes than what's actually being reported. I've even seen cases in which the criticisms that the press has about these specific excerpts are specifically addressed in the text surrounding the quote itself. But somehow, the media doesn't quote the part that criticizes the critiques from the media and just focuses on the quote, removing all context that the criticisms that that quote could inspire have already been addressed in the text itself. Again, I really, really encourage you not to focus on these like very sensationalized quotes or these very editorialized discussions about specific quotes or specific excerpts from the book. Take the book as a whole, take the entire work as a whole. That's how proper media criticism works. Another key theme from the book is that money, power, fame, they're not the be-all and end-all of life, okay? A lot of the criticisms surrounding this book are, oh, he's so privileged. Oh, he grew up wealthy. Oh, he's so out of touch. He doesn't understand how privileged he is and how much wealth he has and blah, blah, blah. I don't get that impression at all from the book. I don't get the impression that he doesn't recognize that he's privileged or doesn't recognize that his life is way different than many, many other people's lives. I just don't get that impression, and I think people that are reading it that way often are just being manipulated by the media narrative that that's what it says instead of actually reading the book. But the point is, privilege isn't everything. We all have privileges. We often say while discussing white privilege, for example, that saying that you have white privilege doesn't mean that you had an easy life. Doesn't mean you've never had struggles. It doesn't mean you've never had problems. It's a privilege in that it means that you don't have to experience certain things like racism, for example, in the case of white privilege. But having a privilege doesn't mean that you've had this perfect life or that you're happy or fulfilled. Harry has grown up in very privileged circumstances, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have regular problems or regular trauma like all the rest of us mere mortals. We all have traumas in our past. We all struggle growing up to understand our identity and what we want to do with our life and who we want to be and what kind of person we want to grow into. Many people struggle with mental health issues. Many people struggle with PTSD like he did. Many people feel misunderstood or feel like others have shared their story in a way that's not true. He can't help that he was born into privilege in the same way that all of us can't erase the privileges that we've been born into, whether it's privileges of our race or our ethnicity or our socioeconomic status, the nationality that we are, country that we were born into, the family system that we've been born into, the sex and gender that we've been born into, sexual orientation we've been born into, whether we were born with disabilities. All of these things, right, are a part of us. We all have privileges. We all have privileges that we were born with. And that's true for Harry as well. He was born into certain privileges that he had no control over, same as anyone with any privilege. All he can do is explain his experiences, his life, and how it's shaped him to who he is today. So to me, it's not a fair criticism to just say, oh, well, Harry is super privileged. Yeah, well spotted, of course. But as someone who is also grown up relatively privileged, not prince privileged, but relatively privileged, I've seen a lot of people that make a lot of money, very successful, but they're emotionally a wreck. They're not fulfilled. They're not happy. And I don't think those stories are less valuable just because they have money and power and fame. Otherwise, why would anybody read anything about any celebrity ever? Like, it just literally doesn't make sense. Another general point that I feel like comes up a lot in the media is the media makes it out to sound like Harry in this book is going after the royal family or paints them in a super, super negative light. I would say in general, the royal family does not come across in a bad light at all in this book. I think that's, again, a woeful misreading of the book if you think that he's painted them to be evil or malicious or horrible or nasty or whatever, that he's painting them all to be villainous. And we'll get to specifically the one word villain that's been popping up later on. But in general, he does not portray anybody in his family as a horrible, malicious, evil, disgusting person. They all come across as flawed human beings, which is what they are. Like we all are. None of them come across as evil or as maliciously doing this and that and this and that. There are certain actions that they do that are wrong, that are morally wrong, that are bad, but the actions of people are not a total portrayal of their character. Harry criticizes certain things that his family members have done or said or ways that they've acted, but he has never gone after their character. Harry's in fact very fair to them. He portrays their loving and kind-hearted sides as well as some of the negative things that they've done. But overall, the picture that he paints of them is very positive. But I think people seem to have trouble. They have a problem with discussions of the royal family because showing the royal family as human beings becomes almost as if you are saying they are bad people, as if most regular human beings are bad or inferior, and the royal family must be seen as superior at all times. So portraying them as anything other than wonderful, superior beings is paramount to calling them evil or horrible or assassinating their character. And that dichotomy doesn't make any sense, right? Just because the royal family are people, regular people that do good things and do bad things and have positive traits and negative traits, portraying that and showing that is not bad. It's not a moral wrong to describe human beings as human beings. This is the brainwashing of monarchy in action. These people are just people, but monarchy can't exist if people don't somehow believe that the royal family are in some ways better than them. And by showing that they in some ways are not better than us, that's a threat. And so instead of the narrative being Harry is portraying his family as regular people who have flaws, but also a lot of positive traits and also a lot of love and also a lot of respect and also funny stories and also humorous moments and also sad moments and also good moments and all that mixed bag, somehow that becomes tantamount to Harry called them the devil. And that's messed up. That's black and white thinking, right? There is gray area. There's nuance. They are not directly descended from God, right? We're past that point, right? We don't believe that the monarchy has divine right, right? Like, we don't believe that. What I also think is strange is that the reaction to the stories in the book that are deeply personal, like I said, Harry is not hiding a lot of things. He is willing to open up about some pretty embarrassing and personal information about himself. But the reaction from the media is interesting because if these deeply personal stories that are in the book were discovered by a paparazzi or in a phone hacking or from some sort of palace insider leaking it to the press would have treated that as news, as their right to publish it and to profit off of it, and spun it however they wanted to spin it. But now that he's revealed it on his own, they turn it on Harry as if he's the problem for saying those stories about his own life, when you know that if the media had discovered those stories, they would have blasted it on the front page. Are you kidding me? If they had discovered frostbitten penis, which we'll get into, if they had discovered frostbitten penis, that would have been on every single tabloid in the UK, and the press would have been like, well, the taxpayers pay their money, so we gotta learn about the frostbitten penis. But somehow when Harry tells that story, it becomes, oh no, how dare you tell that story? That's too private. That's too personal. It's like, it would have been personal whether the media leaked that story or he told that story. But somehow they only seem to be mad when you leak private business about people that you didn't like covertly steal. Somehow it's gone too far when the person who actually experienced it tells it. A lot of this book has Harry, for example, talking about his time in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the media currently is taking these parts of the book and saying, oh, this is a security risk. He's exposing this. This poses a threat. This poses a problem. How dare Harry talk about these military experiences? This is a threat. And yet, when Harry discusses concrete examples of the press leaking his location while they're in active combat, while it was actually happening, his life was put in danger multiple times by the press, which we'll get into. So that's fine. It's fine to actively expose Harry's location when he's in an active war zone and could be actively targeted by terrorists. But for some reason, it's not okay for Harry to talk about those experiences in hindsight, after he's run it by, like, I'm sure many lawyers, after he's thought about which pieces of information specifically would be a security risk or not, and has only put in the things that he has deemed important or possible to put in a book. That's not okay. That's a security risk. But if a tabloid outs your location to the Taliban, that's not a security risk. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. That's why I said you should read the book, right? Because if you're looking at it from the media's perspective, the media is saying things that just don't make sense. They don't add up. So I suggest that you just read the book and come to your own conclusions, do your own research, but not in a crazy way. And overall, I think that this book is going to become very influential. I could see this being read in memoir classes for a long time to come. I mean, it's not obviously the same story as something like The Glass Castle or I'm Glad My Mom Died or Educated, right? Obviously, all of those have very different stories behind them, but I think that it definitely is up there in terms of how the story is told and how it's created and how engaging the writing is. I think it's definitely up there with many other influential memoirs. Obviously, it's going to be influential anyway because it's connected to Prince Harry, obviously, and so that's a big story, no matter how you want to spin it. I think although Harry specifically states that he supports the monarchy, he's said numerous times that he's still pro-monarchy. He's not an anti-monarchist himself. I think the book provides a lot of evidence for why the monarchy doesn't work. I don't think that Harry himself has fully reckoned with that, but maybe give it some time. I think that his story perfectly encapsulates why the monarchy is not only a bad system politically, he obviously doesn't get into the politics aspect of it, but it's also harmful to those within the monarchy, especially the ones that are considered not important. It's harmful to those that are like the heirs because, as we know from like psychology as well, right? Like being labeled, say, like the golden child is harmful in its own ways. Even if on the surface level it looks like, oh, the golden child is the favorite or gets everything or has power and gets to do what they want and make a lot of choices or whatever. Sometimes even when you're in that situation of being like the favorite or the golden child or whatever, that's still harmful because that person believes that they can't mess up, they can't make mistakes, and therefore their life becomes controlled in a different way. But we see obviously from Harry's perspective as the spare that his life was really harmfully affected by being treated as the afterthought, the who cares what happens to you? Let's throw you under the bus. Your reputation doesn't matter as much as other people's reputations within the family. His book perfectly encapsulates that it's a system that time and time again doesn't prioritize the love and support of family, but instead becomes a cutthroat game to stay relevant. It's an unhealthy system for everyone within it. I think a lot of people can relate to toxic family dynamics. Like, who out here has never had a toxic relationship in their life? But imagine your toxic relationship was ingrained in your whole livelihood, your family business, your private life, your public life, your career decisions, your marriage decisions, your family decisions, and there's just no escape to it. That is the monarchy, and I think it's interesting that I believe that this book is in some ways a very influential piece of anti-monarchist literature from someone that doesn't fully understand that no matter how you reinvent the monarchy or recreate the monarchy, this will always be true and it will always lead to harm. And again, that's ignoring the fact of like the political associations of the monarchy and taxpayers literally like giving these people money. So I hope that people walk away from this book really thinking about like becoming fully lowercase r Republican after reading this book. It's not just about the politics, it's also that this system is destructive in many different ways. All right, now it's time to get into spoilers. So big warning, spoilers, spoilers, spoilers. We are getting into the in-depth discussion of the book. If you don't want to be spoiled, go away, come back when you've read the book. And like I said, overall rating, 5 out of 5. This is a great book. This is influential. This is thought-provoking. Go read the book. That's my recommendation. Read the book. All right, let's start. So the book starts with a prologue. The prologue, we flash forward to Prince Philip's funeral in 2021. And this is our first glimpse in the book to the current situation, because obviously all of the Harry and Meghan stuff is way, way, way in the future from the book's chronology, all the way when he's like in his 30s. And we have like a whole bunch of other traumas to get to before we even get to Harry and Meghan, the couple. But this prologue gives us a slight glimpse into the current situation with Charles and William, as we see Prince William waiting in a garden to discuss with Charles and William their fleeing from Canada, and they're fleeing from the UK, essentially. As he waits, he starts to give us little tidbits of some of the major themes of the book. So he discusses Diana as he's reflecting in this garden. He compares her to Arundel, the morning star, because of how bright and vivid she is. And it's clear from the entire book that Diana is represented in the book as the guiding light for Harry's life, that she represents this brightness and this love and this compassion and this guidance and support that Harry is like desperate for throughout his life. And so many times in the book, he just feels so lost and so emotionally broken and so unsure of himself and where he's going with his life. And Diana is always that light that is mentioned throughout the book that sort of leads him in that direction, leads him on the path. So I think that it's great that this is set up in the prologue, because it becomes clearly a reoccurring theme throughout the book, that Diana is always with him as this bright, bright light, this star guiding him through all of these times of trouble. And it also clearly demonstrates that he always has this longing to follow in her footsteps. And because he sees her as this guiding light in his life, he often tries to think of how he can follow in the path that she set for herself while she was alive, and how he can continue that journey and how he can continue that story and that legacy. He also makes reference in this prologue to all of the dead people that are buried in this garden. This includes a reference to Wallace Simpson and Edward VIII, who were both buried here. And he makes reference to them a few times in the book, and I find that interesting that he makes connections to them. Obviously, they're very controversial figures, you know, Nazism and all that, but I do think that the parallels between the Edward VIII Wallace Simpson story and the Harry and Meghan story are apt. The parallels between both couples' desire to be together and how the family jumps into action when it's related to marriages specifically that they don't like. They don't seem to jump into action with anything else. They don't seem to jump into action with abuse from the press or SA from Prince Andrew or any other horrible, disgusting behavior. They never seem to jump into action with that. But the family jumps into action when it's about marriages, because as we know, in monarchy, marriages are about power. Back in the olden days, that's why royal families back in the day had arranged marriages to consolidate power between different factions and different groups, right? Marriage and relationships are, for the most part, the only way in which they see clinging on to power or the destruction of their power. They don't seem to look at any of the other big picture things. So I think that this parallel is very apt because, again, it shows this is a generational trauma, a generational issue in which members of the royal family are driven out by the institution because they're in love, because the family members deign to fall in love with who they fall in love with. He specifically references in the prologue that he, Charles, and William are nearly stepping on Wallace Simpson's face before they start getting into an argument about Harry and Meghan's exit from the royal family. And again, I think that that's a really nice detail because, again, it's just a reference to this sort of generational cycle of trauma and abuse and shadiness, the destruction of their family. And they just can't seem to break out of it, snap out of it, and see, oh, we keep harming members of our own. The prologue ends with Charles and William saying that they do not understand why Harry and Meghan left the United Kingdom. For Harry, he's shocked by this, and me as the reader, I'm also shocked by this because I don't know in what universe they could have no inkling, no understanding about why Harry and Meghan might have been unhappy. Let's read this. So this is a back and forth between Harry and William. Willie, this was supposed to be our home. We were going to live here for the rest of our lives. You left, Harold. Yeah, and you know why? I don't. You don't? I honestly don't. I leaned back. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was one thing to disagree about who was at fault or how things might have been different, but for him to claim total ignorance of the reasons I'd fled the land of my birth, the land for which I'd fought and been ready to die, my mother country, that fraught phrase, to claim no knowledge of why my wife and I took the drastic step of picking up our child and just running like hell, leaving behind everything, house, friends, furniture. Really? I looked up at the trees. You don't know? Harold, I honestly don't. I turned to Pa. He was gazing at me with an expression that said, neither do I. Wow, I thought, maybe they really don't. Staggering, but maybe it was true. And if they didn't know I had left, maybe they just didn't know me at all. And maybe they never really did. And to be fair, maybe I didn't either. This is a really intriguing conversation to read because I honestly cannot tell from how this is portrayed whether or not Charles and William are actively gaslighting Harry in this moment. pretending that they don't understand why he would feel unsafe or unprotected, or if they're genuinely like so trapped within their own bubble, within their own perspectives, their own like parallel reality, that they can't see the actual reality that we live in. And it's hard to read from that conversation, but part of me really feels like it's got to be gaslighting, right? It's got to be gaslighting, that they're just denying Harry his own reality to make Harry feel crazy. And there's definitely some hints of that later on in the book too. We'll get into that. But this is the first sense that we get that whether or not they're maliciously gaslighting him or unintentionally gaslighting him, or if they're genuinely like, they genuinely just don't understand, this just gives a sense of like how distant and how disconnected Charles and William are from Harry, that they cannot step inside his shoes, step inside his perspective, empathize with him. And that's scary. That's pretty scary to hear that the royal family is like so checked out from reality. The book doesn't describe anything later on in which Charles and William like act maliciously. And I think that's related to Harry humanizing his family members. And I think that's great, that shows that he's willing to extend empathy to them. And he portrays them with nuance. He does not make it seem like any of the negative actions that they take within the book are actively evil or anything. However, as a reader, I do find it very difficult to believe that Charles and William were not acting obtuse in this conversation. Right after that part I just read, the prologue ends with Harry making a direct plea to Charles and William to read the book and to read it as an explanation of why Harry and Meghan left, but more specifically Harry. It does get into why Meghan would want to leave, but really this is Harry's story. This is Harry's whole journey through growing up in this situation. And I like that he leaves us on that thought. This book should be read as the whole explanation as to why he left, rather than just looking at the few years or the few months before he and Meghan left and looking at it through this sort of Megxit lens. Instead, looking at his departure through analyzing his entire life and all the shit that he had to go through. And I like that he also presents this as, Charles and William, I'm writing this so that you understand. I want to provide you with my experience, with the context of my whole life. I think it's very powerful, even as someone that's not Charles or William, obviously. As a reader, I can definitely feel that sentiment throughout the whole book. He also speaks of them in very loving terms, and he always comes back to that deep longing to love them and be loved. I think that this is a very smart move, and I think that it calls on us, the rest of the readers, to read the book through that lens as well, as Harry talking directly to his family. And I think that makes the message more powerful. This is similar to a letter. It's similar to a written plea to be understood. Now, the rest of the chapters tend to be much shorter and more concise and more like vignettes. So the first chunk I want to talk about is chapters 1 through 7. In chapters 1 through 7, Harry starts to describe his childhood, but the focus is, of course, on Diana, around his mother, right before her death, learning about her death, and the immediate aftermath of her death, such as the funeral. And one interesting thing that I noticed, and the reason why this comes up first is because it's in the first chapter, is I noticed that Harry never directly mentions Dodi Al-Fayed by name. He actively calls him blah blah when he discusses meeting Dodi Al-Fayed for the first time. I don't know if this is for legal purposes or to protect the Al-Fayed family, but we do get the sense that William and Harry never really knew Dodi Al-Fayed, and that they really struggled with this disconnect from their mother, because it was very clear to them, even from a young age, that Diana is not a part of the family anymore. He specifically references he saw it that the family was punishing her. She is no longer a part of us. And the way that her funeral plays down also demonstrates that even at a young age, even around age 12 or so, that he was recognizing that his mother was being otherized by the family. She's not part of us. She's distant from us. We don't get to see her all the time. That there was definitely that strain and that he was being pulled away from his mother somewhat by the family. He also points out that even from a young age, he immediately recognized that he was different from the rest of his family members. He understood that his role was different. He understood that it was different for him than for other people who were in the direct line of succession. That is, again, that leaves a huge imprint on his life, right? Knowing from a very, very early age that you are being treated differently or that you are being perceived differently from others, that's some mental health problems waiting to happen. It shows that Harry, from a young age, always thought of himself as the spare, even when he didn't have the language or terminology, or even if he wasn't called the spare, he always got the sense that he was the spare. He recognized that he was treated differently. He recognized he was being, in some ways, pitted against his brother. It's damaging when you're put in a position as a child where you're already being labeled as disposable or not as important or as an outsider to your family, especially a sibling. And we can see clearly that Harry was cognizant of that, but maybe didn't necessarily have the language to express why this frustrated him or why this put him in a very difficult situation. In these first few chapters, Harry also describes the moment when he was told that Diana was killed in the crash. He points out numerous times throughout the book that Charles was loving and sympathetic to Harry, but that he also struggles to express his emotions. And he doesn't really provide space for William or Harry to express their emotions to him. In the scene, we see that Charles doesn't hug Harry. He puts his hand on his knee, and he specifically mentions to Harry, "It's going to be okay," which to me, I don't know. I know that most of the royal family doesn't have a lot of a social emotional learning background, but I don't know if it's a great thing to say to a 12-year-old boy when his mother has literally just died and said it's going to be okay. Because clearly it was not. And especially it was not going to be when everything that happened. I think many people can understand how rough it would be for Charles in that situation to have to tell a child that their parent is dead. I mean, that's devastating. It's heartbreaking. I understand how that would be a struggle, especially for someone that doesn't know how to process their own emotions or how to guide their children through that experience of processing emotions. But yeah, it's just true that that's trauma, right? That's adding to the trauma. And we see the repercussions of this trauma throughout the book. We see Harry deny for years and years and years that Diana was even dead. We see drug problems. We see his hopelessness, his despair. Yes, he has sympathy for Charles in this moment, and I think we as the reader are meant to have sympathy for Charles and all that he's been through and all that he had to go through while growing up with these two young boys without a mother. But also, it doesn't detract from the fact that it's still added trauma on top of the trauma on top of the trauma. We see immediately after the revelation that his mother has passed away, that it immediately becomes all about the press. They go to church just like any other regular day. They're getting photographed. They're getting that intense press coverage, and they have to be on for the performance for the press. That's why I like to make the comparison to, say, like Jeanette McCurdy's experience, because if William and Harry were child actors, for example, I think with all of the media that has come out from former child stars speaking out against their past traumas, speaking out against the way they were treated by the media, the awareness that we have now about the dangers of childhood celebrity. I think that we fully understand how psychologically damaging it can be for a child where they feel like they need to be on, that they're not allowed to just be a kid, but have to be camera ready. And we definitely see this in the first couple of chapters. They have to be on. They smile and shake hands outside of Kensington Palace. They're surrounded by the British public openly grieving and distraught by this news. And yet they have to be on. They have to be performing the strong, serious, manly facade in order for others to process this grief when this is the passing of their own mother. He specifically says in the book, I remember consoling several folks who were prostrate, overcome, as if they knew Mummy, but also thinking, you didn't though. You act as if you did, but you didn't know her. I can fully understand this. I think a lot of people in those moments of grief, sometimes it can be strange when people give you condolences and they are so overcome, but maybe you're not so overcome. And they talk about how much they loved somebody or how much they respected somebody that's passed. And you're like, but I'm the one that actually knows them. And you start to judge other people's grief because you're like, well, you're having this reaction to somebody that you don't fully understand, but I can't seem to have that reaction. And I actually knew them. I actually was in the same room with them day in and day out many, many times and know their ins and outs. To go through that as a 12-year-old on a worldwide scale is impossible for me to fully understand. Also, getting more into the mourning process and the funeral for Diana, we learned that there was a consideration for only William to walk behind Diana's coffin. Diana's brother Charles specifically said that he did not want that to happen, but the palace's plan was either it's got to be just William or both William and Harry. And so that puts Harry in the position, again at 12 years old, to basically think, I have to go on this journey with my brother because I don't want to leave my brother out there in the cold all alone to do this walk. The entire discussion of Diana's funeral and her is really sad. But there's also another key point that gets referenced here, which is again about how the family had constantly perpetuated this notion that Diana was a persona non grata in the family. And imagine growing up knowing that your mother was so otherized by the rest of your family. This is at her funeral. The 8 Welsh guards moved forward, hoisted the enormous lead-lined coffin, which was now draped in the royal standard, an extraordinary break with protocol. They'd also yielded to pressure and lowered the flag to half-mast. Not the royal standard, of course, but the Union Jack. Still, an unprecedented compromise. The royal standard was also reserved for members of the royal family, which I'd been told Mummy wasn't anymore. Did this mean she was forgiven? By Granny? Apparently. But these were questions I couldn't quite formulate, let alone ask an adult, as the coffin was slowly carried outside and loaded into the back of a black hearse. There's so much to unpack here. One bit is that reoccurring throughout the novel, he mentions this discussion of why is there a Union Jack on Mummy's coffin, which is, again, obviously the Union Jack has become a trigger in some ways for Harry, which is also really sad. When the memory that you have of the flag of your nation that you're meant to represent brings back trauma of your dead mother, that's uncomfortable to grow up and live in. But also this whole section really focuses on Harry at a young age understanding that his mother was being punished, saying, did this mean she was forgiven? And now think about that. What did Diana do wrong? What did Diana do wrong? What was she meant to be forgiven for? She married Charles. Charles cheated on her. He didn't love her. She gave him 2 kids, 2 wonderful kids. She did great charity work. She was the people's princess. She tried to foster her own independence and set boundaries with the press and the media. Divorced a man who clearly didn't love or respect her. And yet, Harry has already internalized this process. Did this mean she was forgiven? Forgiven for what? But think about that. When you are always have that feeling that the family is going to ask for forgiveness of people just living their goddamn lives, it puts you in a weird mental space, and we can see that throughout the book. It's amazing after the funeral that everyone says that things are back to normal. And again, is everyone in the family just like heartless? The chapter 7 here is set in September 1997. Princess Diana died at the end of August 1997. A month later, and people are trying to say things are back to normal. Again, this is why we need SEL in schools, folks. Like, some people clearly need to be taught how emotions work. Literally, Harry is just right back to school. It seems like nobody wants to mention or discuss that his mother just died. It's been a month. If I were a teacher at Harry's school and I had a student that literally their mother died a month before and I didn't refer them immediately to counseling, that would be on my report. And that's me as a public school teacher. Like, I can't imagine. You go to Ludgrove and they don't seem to know like the basics of quality education to get students the emotional support that they need. Is it really a quality education, or is it just an elitist education? Chew on that one. Chapters about 7, 8 to 14 mostly detail Harry's life at school. I am always very fascinated by this part because as someone that's a teacher, very dedicated to education, I always want to learn what makes education good. What does it mean to be educated? What does it mean to be an educational institution? This kind of stuff is fascinating to me because I think, as a teacher, just my opinion, these elite schools do not provide quality education as we understand it, as the research has shown, as we know more about how your brain develops, how you learn, how you process. As we know about the brain, we develop better and better ways of providing quality education, but these fancy schmancy schools consistently seem to not provide a quality education. They provide an elitist education. They provide an education that is in its own little bubble, but in which I would argue there's a lot of learning that's missing. We see in chapter 8 that Harry discusses the matrons at his school. They call themselves mums away from mums. And obviously, as a child that has just gone through the trauma of losing their mom, we see that Harry is always looking for that maternal figure in his life. And of course, right after the death of his mom is no different. He describes different matrons at the school that he starts to have this sort of this longing for a maternal relationship, but also as a 12-year-old boy that's coming into sexual maturity, also that weird puberty as well. And I know a lot of people have and we'll talk about some of the other bits in the book too. I know a lot of people have made this comment that the book seems a little Freudian because there's a lot of parts in the book that seem to have this mix of a maternal figure but also this sexual component to it. This is the first example, and I think that, again, this is totally honest. I think that for a young boy to lose his mother but also be going through puberty and also having these sexual urges, I think that there is definitely this struggle with wanting to have that caring relationship, that nurturing relationship, and also a sexual relationship. Yes, it's a little bit Freudian, but I think that's, I think a lot of men are like that. A lot of men want to marry wifeys that also remind them of a mother and take care of them like a mother. I don't think that's unique to Harry. And again, going through this trauma, wanting that sort of loving, tender connection from not just the women at his school, but I think wanting that parental, caring, guiding perspective from all of his teachers. And I'll get into more how he talks about many different teachers throughout his life, even if he doesn't consider them teachers. I think that it's just another piece of evidence of how lost, how confused Harry was, and he was not provided support by his parent or the rest of his family or by his school. And I think that all those people in his life that had a position of authority over him are responsible for letting this slip through the cracks. Again, like I said, in a public school, if I had a student that was going through a trauma like this and I didn't report it and I didn't get that student support, you bet your ass that would be on my teacher evaluation. Like, you bet your ass somebody would tell me that I wasn't doing my job. And yet somehow when it's Ludgrove or Eton or whatever, because they're providing traditional elite education, somehow they just don't believe that it's their responsibility to act on students' physical, mental, emotional well-being. Doesn't make sense to me. He specifically mentions that the boys would always be on the lookout for this one teacher named Pat, who was like considered like the strict evil teacher. Whoever was on lookout for this like strict teacher would cry. He writes in the book KV, Latin, I think. I want to clarify for Harry if he hasn't learned this yet. They were saying cave. Maybe they said it incorrectly, but they were saying cave, which means beware in Latin. I only say that because I got to put my degree to use, okay? That's why it's called the Catulla bubble, okay? So yes, they were saying cave, like caveat emptor, Another example of how I find schools like these are elite institutions, but not quality education, is in chapter 9, we get Harry discussing that there is a letter writing day at this school where all the boys are required to write letters home to their parents. This sounds like cult behavior. By the way, like, nobody should ever be forced to write a letter to somebody that they don't want to write to. And he discusses why, again, this was upsetting because even when his parents were both alive, they were divorced. And so being the child of a divorced parent and communicating with both parents, especially when those parents do not co-parent effectively or they hold a lot of resentment between each other, is a very difficult position for a child to be put in. And again, a teacher should never put that on a child. A teacher should recognize that, oh, being a child of divorced parents is a difficult situation, and we shouldn't put a child in a position where they struggle being the sort of go-between of their parents. Again, I want to make sure that not only are we critiquing the royal family and critiquing, monarchy and whatever, we should also be critiquing these schools, because if me, a regular old teacher, I've worked in many different situations, many different age levels. If I did something like this, I would feel like I was in the wrong. But of course, this got even worse and more challenging after Diana died. And he was asked, basically forced to write a final letter to Diana. Now, again, in a controlled therapeutic or counseling environment, would writing a letter to your dead mother be potentially a therapeutic process? Absolutely. 100% absolutely. Your teacher peering over you and saying, write a letter to your dead mother that just passed like a few months ago? Ridiculous. You should never be putting a child in that situation. Why not, instead of making it mandatory write to your parents, why not just make it an exercise they can write a letter to whoever they want? And that could be an interesting sort of journaling process as well. Write a letter to anybody in your family. Write a letter to a famous author. Write a letter to your friend. Write a letter to someone that you believe loves and supports you. Not forcing a child to write a letter to parents that maybe they might feel distant from for some reason or another, but also to a dead parent when that parent has just died and and it's not of that student's own volition. It's not a suggestion, hey, write a letter. It's like, do this. SEL in schools, guys. Like, again, it just shows these institutions are not quality education. At least they weren't at this time. I don't know if they've changed, but knowing people that lived in the UK and went to schools like this, part of me believes that nothing has changed. So they love their tradition over there, even if that tradition is potentially triggering and traumatic. Here he also mentions a trip to South Africa taken with his father. His thoughts on this are interesting, but I think that this is more interesting in the context of Prince Charles trying to rehabilitate his image after Diana's death, because people that are not like wee tadpoles remember a time when Prince Charles was hated. People could not even fathom him ever being king because he was considered just such a despicable person who ruined Diana's life, ultimately led to her death, had cheated on her, was still with his adulteress. To see that Harry even recognized that this was mostly for his father, and he tried to make this trip such like a father-son bonding moment and to try and feel connected to his father. And there is a little bit of that, but there's always that thought in the back of their mind, right? This is a PR stunt. This is for my father's like PR benefit. He doesn't give a fuck about spending time with me. This is all about him. It's toxic. Harry also talks about an experience in class where he was mocked for being a bad student, especially in history, which again, it seems like their history class was just memorizing dates and kings and queens and names and whatever, which again, not quality education. Like most history teachers nowadays can tell you that teachers are taught not to teach history as just like a memorization and drills and whatever and dates and facts and figures or whatever. History is about critically examining primary sources, secondary sources. It's not anything like what is going on in this classroom. This is traditional education, like blast from the past. Okay, that's maybe how they taught history in like the early 1900s, but like this should not be what a history class looks like. And not only that, he is openly mocked by his instructors because he should know this stuff because his family is the royalty. So he should be able to remember all the kings and queens of England and whatever. This should be a teachable moment for the teacher because you should never put any child on the spot like that. You should never put any student on the spot like that. And for him to say, and this is a quote from the book, "It's good for you, Wales. The more I call on you, the more you'll learn." You, of course, as a teacher, want to encourage your students to participate, but participation is not the same as calling a student out and embarrassing them. Reflect on this. Again, like I said, as a teacher, like some of these parts about school and teaching are really fascinating to me. Oh, he also speaks to corporal punishment. Keep in mind, we're in the late 90s, and he describes they would give me a tremendous clout, always with a copy of the New English Bible, the hardback version. Literally, children getting hit with books as punishment in 1997. Not a quality education. We know for a fact that corporal punishment in school or at home, hurting or hitting a child is not productive. It is not learning. It is conditioning fear. In chapter 14, we also get a discussion of Prince Charles making jokes or comments to Harry that somewhat reference questioning Harry's paternity. And like he says, even if Charles said these things as a joke, we can see why Harry would not consider this funny for his father, his own father, to participate in these kind of like dismissive rumors about him not being his real father. The actual quote is he quotes Charles. Well, I should say he doesn't quote Charles. This is all in italics, which I think for legal purposes is like, this is the gist of what he said, but maybe he didn't actually say this. Who knows if I'm really the Prince of Wales? Who knows if I'm even your real father? Maybe your real father is in Broadmoor, darling boy. Of course, Harry says, I don't really think this is very funny because every single biography, every single discussion of my life always brings up this rumor that Prince Charles isn't my real father. And I think that this, again, points to a lot of themes later on in the book where Charles is always dismissive of how words have an impact and how they can shape other people's perceptions subconsciously for a long period of time. Yes, this is just a joke, but it's a joke supposedly that keeps getting repeated and repeated and repeated in Harry's life, where people question who his real father is. And often they mention that his real father must be Major Hewitt, who his mother had an affair with after he was born. Yes, something can be said in jest, but it doesn't mean that that joke is not constantly haunting that other person. It's not like this one joke came and went, and it was just one comment and Harry never heard this again. He's heard this consistently his entire life, almost in every biography about him. It's repeated constantly in the tabloids and the press. There's constantly pictures trying to compare him to Major Hewitt and try to dissect if Major Hewitt was his real father. The one comment is not the issue, but it continues to be perpetuated over and over again in Harry's life. So for his own father to make comments like that shows that his father doesn't truly understand the impact of these words. And we see that throughout the book because one of the reoccurring themes is Prince Charles telling Harry, don't read it, my darling boy. Don't read the tabloids. Don't read what's being said about you, as if not hearing or seeing those things means that they won't have an impact on you. And that's literally not true. Those words are impacting how other people perceive you, and their perception changes how they treat you. And for some reason, Charles can't wrap his head around this. And it becomes a major point of contention throughout their entire relationship. Even if it's just a small thing, even if it seems small or insignificant, words change the perception of another person, and that perception can have real life consequences. And Harry has had to suffer the consequences of constantly having his paternity questioned. And speaking of his parents' infidelity, he immediately turns it in chapter 15 to focus on the reality, which is not his mother cheating on somebody after he was born, but on his father having the other woman being Camilla, of course. Now, the discussions of Camilla in the book are interesting. And I would say if Harry portrays any royal family member in a particularly negative light, it would be Camilla. And you know what? Good on him, because Camilla sounds like an asshole. And, I'm a bit of a loudmouth myself, and I have no problem calling out someone when they're being a total asshole. Let's just say I get it. I 100% get it. Harry and William don't like this bitch. I like that he references Camilla's PR campaign to becoming the future queen consort. Going from the other woman, homewrecker, destroyer of marriages, absolute bottom of the barrel, all the way up to future and now current queen consort of the United Kingdom. We always see her machinations in that direction. Everything is about getting slightly higher and higher up the ladder. And we see that with how Camilla orchestrates meeting the boys for the first time. And that's not to say that Camilla is only solely responsible for this. Charles is most definitely also responsible for this, and Harry specifically mentions that because he points out numerous times that Charles was dead set, dead focused on having Camilla be above board. He wasn't satisfied just having Camilla as a partner. He wanted to almost in some ways prove that he could rehabilitate her, that he could change public opinion so drastically that not only could they be together, but they could get married, that she could get titles, that she could really be on the journey to power as the future king and queen. He couldn't just be satisfied with loving her and being with her. And she couldn't be satisfied with that either. That thirst for wanting everything to be above board and for people to accept them together, they had such tunnel vision. It's almost as if they couldn't see or didn't want to see or didn't care that it would potentially be harmful to their children. He contrasts how Camilla's first meeting with William was really well detailed, that she really made an effort to reach out to him, to formally meet with him. And we also see that effort was definitely in getting the perfectly crafted narrative to sell to the tabloids, because we see that the story that was leaked to the tabloids was, from all accounts, true. But because we know it was true, and yet there were really only 2 people in the room, and we know that William didn't leak that story, that it was most certainly Camilla crafting that story, specifically about how she met William. And we see that in contrast to how she met Harry. She didn't seem to give a fuck about Harry. It was just a check. Yeah, I met Harry. Everything's cool. But it didn't have the same prestige as the heir. And again, from Harry's perspective, like, ignore the whole royal family issue, right? Your father is bringing a new person into his life. Somebody that is potentially going to be your stepmother. And to feel like that stepmother doesn't actually care about making a good impression on you or wanting to be involved with your life at all, yeah, I'd be pretty pissed too. And for your father to not seem to care that your stepmother doesn't seem to care about you, it's like step parenting 101. If that relationship isn't made to feel like it could be, doesn't have to be like a fully maternal loving relationship, but if you get the sense that your step parent doesn't give a fuck about you, how are you gonna have a healthy relationship? How are you gonna have a healthy family dynamic? He also points out that both him and William specifically asked Charles not to marry Camilla. They didn't want that kind of comparison between Camilla and their mother. They didn't want the hullabaloo of having to reconcile Camilla as being like officially a part of their family. Keep in mind, they have just lost Diana. And to feel like not only was there a campaign from their father and this other woman to almost replace Diana, but that replacement was the woman whom their father had an affair with, that caused the pain and hurt of their mother to recognize that she was never loved by him and that he was cheating on him. And she just died? Again, it boggles my mind. Like I said, Harry portrays Charles very sympathetically in the book, but as a father, it's like, how obtuse, how emotionally unintelligent do you have to be to think that this would be hurtful to your own children? Like, why wouldn't you want to go slow? Why wouldn't you want to listen to their pleas not to marry this woman? It's just baffling to me, mind-boggling to me. So chapter 16 to 20, we get to Harry going to Eton. So again, as a teacher, I'm always interested, is Eton providing a good education? Seems like they're providing, listen, I love school traditions. I love like wacky, like old British school traditions. Like, I get it. But again, like, it just seems like the way that the school and the system is set up, as a teacher, I want to create an environment that's welcoming, that's not overwhelming. Lower the affective filter of my students, make them feel comfortable, make them feel like it's a safe environment. The way that he describes that the school just seems like very bad at onboarding and being very overwhelming and not providing that support, a transition to the school. Again, if me working at a fucking public school can provide a better school transition experience for my students than fucking Eton, like, how are you gonna learn when your school is not providing you the resources to feel comfortable and to fully understand the environment that you just walked into? How are you ever gonna learn? We as teachers, we have to take care of the whole person, right? And make sure that the human being and the body in that classroom, in that school, in that community is mentally and physically ready to learn, because learning is a difficult mental process. Again, how are you going to learn when you feel like you're not being provided any resources? And he specifically mentions going into a French class. And I find this so interesting because, again, I also studied French for like 17 years. I have a degree in French. I just want to read this part. I know that nobody gives a fuck about this part except for me, but I'm going to read about this French lesson. The situation became undeniably obvious during my very first French lesson. I was astounded to hear the teacher conducting the entire class in rapid, non-stop French. He assumed for some reason that we were all fluent. Now, firstly, again, I'm a language teacher, okay? I'm actually an ESL teacher. I have had to study a lot about language acquisition, language learning. I have a master's in TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages. I know a lot about second language acquisition, and this ain't it. A teacher walking into the room, speaking in rapid, non-stop French, it sounds like with no scaffolds, no visuals. This is bad second language acquisition. This is not good language learning. So why do we believe that Eton is providing a quality education? They're not. They're not following the basics of what we learn from second language acquisition research. Comprehensible input? Where? Crashing existed in the 70s. This class took place in 1998, and we didn't learn anything about comprehensible input. We didn't learn anything about how to provide scaffolds or visuals or to lower the affective filter. Nothing. Why should anybody be paying this price for this shitty education? He goes on, maybe everyone else was, but me, fluent, because I did passably well in the entrance exam? Au contraire, mon ami. Afterwards, I went up to him, explained that there'd been a dreadful mistake and I was in the wrong class. Now, you as the teacher also need to reflect on, am I doing the right thing as a teacher? Is my teaching effective? Is my instruction effective? And obviously this teacher, their teaching is not effective if they're speaking truly in rapid nonstop French on the first day. Goes on. He told me to relax, assured me I'd be up to speed in no time. He didn't get it. He had faith in me. So I went to my housemaster, begged him to put me with the slower talkers, the more glacial learners. Boys exactement comme moi. And it's so strange because, again, I've been in this situation too as a language teacher. Harry passed an entrance exam that showed that he was in the right class, and instead of his teacher reassuring him that he was gonna help him to be successful at that level that he was placed into, he had to feel like, oh, I need to go to the dumb class. I need to downgrade. I'm not smart enough to be here. I'm not in the right place. And that's no way to be. He also in this chapter talks about how William just was like, pretend like you don't know me. Don't come to me. Don't be friends with me. Yeah, we're both at Eton, but like, don't come in my direction. I think it's pretty normal for siblings that go to the same school, but I can understand why from a younger sibling's perspective, that would be super, super hurtful. You feel like you have nobody else in this world. You're going through all this shit, all this trauma. You're adjusting to a new school, a school that seems to give zero fucks about onboarding you properly. And you try to turn to the one person in the school that you know, your own brother, and your brother is just like, get out of my face. Don't come to me. I can imagine Harry would feel absolutely, truly alone. He even specifically points to one memory in which his classmates shaved his head, just doing stupid teenage boy shit. He goes to his brother upstairs, feels like this is crossing the line that William has set. I violated the sacred rule, the one shining commandment never to be broken, and ran upstairs to Willie's room. You feel like you can't even go to your own brother because of some sacred rule that you're not supposed to talk or acknowledge each other's existence? When you're in this like crazy mixed up world, that's just wrong. He speaks to his brother thinking it's funny, but also just not being very helpful. And I think that, again, this shows Harry feeling like he's trying so desperately to try to turn to people to look for some love or care or support, or just to hear him out, or to validate his experience or validate his emotions. And a lot of times his feelings are invalidated. And this is an example of William sort of invalidating his feelings and just sort of pointing and laughing at him and saying like, you're a fucking idiot. Out of context, we could see this as like, oh, this is just like regular brother stuff. Literally, they have no parental figures. They're at a boarding school. They don't have any contact with their one remaining parent, really, other than, I don't know, forced to write letters or whatever. They're the only ones that have each other. William is his only person that's been ride or die his whole life. And again, William's going through his own shit too. He's going through his own traumas. I'm not trying to put all the blame on William. This is not just, oh, William laughed at his bald head, which is funny. But this is also like William not being the big, supportive, loving big brother that he could have really stepped up and been. And again, he's a young baby too, so like he didn't necessarily know how to do that. But we can definitely see that something like this would continue to shape Harry, who's been constantly looking for that sort of familial figures, looking for family, literally and figuratively, looking for like a found family. Moving into chapters 19-20, Harry starts to discuss more how the press started to label him as sort of the naughty one. There always seems to be in the press this need for comparisons between different members of the family, and it's always easier to make it into a contrast, make it into a battle, or make it into foils. And so Harry starts to become the naughty one. We know from childhood development, child psychology, it's pretty harmful for children to be labeled as naughty, to be labeled as bad kids or naughty kids. It's always going to backfire. It's always going to backfire. Again, as a teacher, I've worked with not only children, but adults. I've worked with like the whole range. If you start labeling children naughty, it will come back to bite you so fast. It'll come back to bite you so fast, because when children believe that they are being perceived as the naughty one or being perceived as one of the bad kids, then they will do it. They will do everything in their power to make that a self-fulfilling prophecy, because they're like, well, hey, if I'm going to be labeled as the bad kid or the naughty kid, I might as well do all the bad and naughty things, because no matter what I do, doesn't matter if I cure fucking cancer, if people are constantly perceiving me as the naughty one, even if I do good things and I'm not acknowledged for doing good things, right? And I'm only acknowledged for my faults or for all the bad things that I do, then I might as well just keep doing bad things. There's no point in trying to be better or to grow or to learn from mistakes. Might as well just keep making those same mistakes over and over again, because no matter what I do, I've got this label. Even if this wasn't the doing of his family, and we can kind of see how, like, again, that relationship between the royal family and the press is a relationship, and it is there. The royal family in some ways is complicit. Even if, let's take the royal family away from it, even if it was just the press labeling him as the naughty one, that is still a whole world of readers, a whole world that sees you as the bad kid. What is ever going to make you want to change or grow if you feel like you are constantly going to be labeled the bad kid? It's like child development 101. You should never be thinking of a child or a human being, for that matter, as just good or bad, black and white thinking. All human beings, all children, all people are complex individuals. Sometimes they do good things, sometimes they do bad things. Sometimes they have positive traits, sometimes they have negative traits. And Harry is no different, right? Yes, did he do bad things? Did he have bad actions or say bad things or, make mistakes? Absolutely. He's a human being. But he should never have felt like the media was labeling him as a child. If I wouldn't accept that of a parent, why would I accept that of the press? I would never accept a parent telling me, if a parent came to me in a parent-teacher conference and they said, oh yeah, my child is like bad. My kid's a bad kid. I would tell that parent, no, your child is not a bad kid. They are going through something. There's behavioral issues that we need to address. We need to have consequences for bad behavior. But bad behavior does not make a child a bad person. It does not reflect on their character. There is always some positives. There's always some good in someone. And if you go into the mindset of labeling someone like that, you are gonna set up that child and yourself for a world of hurt, because they're never gonna wanna change if they feel like there's no way to change because they've already been slapped with this label. He also specifically mentions it's as if the press or the media or anybody in his circle doesn't think back to like the most obvious reasoning for why he might be struggling in school or why he might be struggling with being naughty or whatever, which is the big elephant in the room, is that his mother just died. And yet nobody seems to want to talk about that point. As a parent, as a teacher or an educator, your responsibility is to recognize that trauma and to do something about it. And it's so interesting that the media narrative started to just completely erase the cause and merely focus on the effect. They didn't want to focus on why is Harry acting out? Why might he be struggling to get good grades? Why can't he concentrate? Why is he doing this and that and the other? Instead of focusing on why he might be like that, namely that not only just had his mom die, he's had to transfer schools, he's had to change schools, which changing schools is also can be a difficult thing for a child. Being removed from one learning environment and being put in another learning environment, that is also difficult. He's got all this other shit going on in the background with his familial relationships. This distance from William, this distance from his father. Everyone in his life seems to want to put all of that, ignore all of the causes, and just look at his effects, his behavior. That's never a good way to analyze somebody, is to just take what you're seeing in front of your eyes and not to delve into, well, why did that happen? Humans react or do things because of something else inside themselves. And to not ask why, again, to dehumanize another person. And he's had to deal with this dehumanization as a teenager. I could never. Chapters 21 to 24 is where we start to see more of how this relationship to going to Africa, traveling to Africa, starts to become Harry's escape or this release, and also becomes a connection to, again, that guiding light of his mother. What's really, again, mind-boggling to me, crazy to me, is he mentions that this was not his choice. He was told that he was going to Africa. He writes, "It was the same old problem," he explained. "I was facing a longish school holiday over Easter, and something needed to be done with me. So Africa, Botswana to be precise, a safari." I don't know about you, but if my parent walked into my room as a teenager, I could just end it there. If my parent walked into my room as a teenager, you know, the hormones and the anxiety and the rage and the everything that you hate being a teenager, tensions are high. If my parent walked into my room and told me that I was going on a trip by myself, because also he gets to the point that he's not going on this trip. I'm going by myself. He's going with his brother, but like, again, they're two kids by themselves. And you read between the lines and you recognize that it's because something needed to be done with you. Basically your father doesn't want to hang out with you, doesn't want to have bonding time with you, which again, it shows again, looking back at that South Africa trip, how Harry really wanted to like bond with his father and have this like father-son relationship bonding moment on the trip. And he kind of saw this as, oh, maybe we're getting close or whatever. And then the second time, it's basically like, you're going to Africa because I don't give a fuck about you and I got other shit to do. Hurtful. And maybe that's not how he put it, but it would be so hurtful to me. It's like those parents that tell their children that they're going away to summer camp with like no discussion about where the camp is going to be or what it's going to be or whatever, and just not even having a conversation with that kid and being like, you're going away for like 2 months. It's traumatizing. It's traumatizing. At least have a conversation with your child. Why not have a conversation with him and be like, what do you want to do for your Easter break? But again, that's not how the royal family operates, because they're toxic as fuck and they want to control everything. And it's just like, you do what you're told. You don't get to have opinions. You don't get to chat. I don't want you here. You're going to Africa.
Do you have any black friends at home, Mari?
We're introduced to two characters. Marco, who seems to be William's minder or some sort of like staff for William, and Tiggy, who was their nanny growing up. He also mentions how he knew growing up that his mother saw Tiggy as a rival, because there was a lot of rumors circulating that Charles was in love with Tiggy or wanted a relationship with Tiggy or was sleeping with Tiggy, or all sorts of drama between them, and how he recognized that, again, there was something kind of upsetting to him in that he clearly had this sort of like sexual attraction to Tiggy, but also knew that that was kind of a betrayal of his mother, because his mother had always been like paranoid of Twiggy. I know people are going to be like, this is Freudian, and it's like, yeah, it's Freudian, but I can also like totally understand. He is a teenage boy. This lady is attractive and also happens to have a connection to his mother. And yeah, I can understand why he would need a therapist or something to unpack that one. But at the end of this chapter, we get to see that this unlocks something in Harry, and from this point forward, Africa and Botswana in particular play a very specific role in Harry's journey to heal or to grow up and become himself and find himself. I know that's very like British colonial, and that will be addressed in the book later, but it truly did become that way for him. And he can't help it that that's like a British colonial story that has moved across generations and generations of white people discovering themselves in Africa. I mean, it's true. It was the only place where you could kind of find like solace and be with himself. At the end of the chapter, he says, I think more of this, please. More fire, more talk, more loud laughter. I'd been scared of darkness all my life, and it turned out Africa had a cure. The campfire. The theme of light and light in the darkness, how he was so fearful of the dark, how he was scared of the dark, and how he realizes that you can still light up the darkness and find some positives. The reason why I mentioned earlier that Harry's book is a lot about the different teachers in his life is that there are many different people that act as teachers in Harry's life that aren't necessarily in the classroom. I believe that we can all, in our own ways, be teachers to other people or be taught by teachers inside and outside the classroom. And he is very good in this book at really shining a light on the real teachers in his life, the people that really made him into the person that he was. And one of these people is Marco. He specifically says Marco, however, wasn't your typical teacher. He talks about how Marco almost like he wanted to be like Marco because he saw himself in Marco. He saw the ginger hair. He saw him as this like big masculine figure, and that he sort of was desperate to learn from him. He says he was more about leading by example and having a good time. And that is like number one of being a teacher, teaching other people. lead by example and have a good time. Two things that it doesn't look like they got it eaten. And speaking of eaten, he also quotes, "I wanted to ask Willie what it was like to have such a man minding him, guiding him, but apparently the Eton rule carried over to Botswana. Willie didn't want to know me in the bush any more than he did back at school." Just reiterating that William seems to have totally disconnected from Harry. Harry is desperate for family, desperate for connection, desperate for this guidance, right? He talks about how, Marco, he wants to know how Marco is guiding William in his life because he's so desperate for that guidance. And William just doesn't seem to, like he said, he doesn't want to know me. I think we all can relate. Well, maybe this is showing myself too much, but I think we can all relate to having that feeling of like, I want you to know me. I want you to get to know me. Especially if someone that you really care about, getting the sense that they don't want to know you. Doesn't matter the situation, the circumstances, who's in the room, who's not in the room. They just don't seem curious to know what's going on in your brain. And it's hurtful. It's hurtful to like think that your own brother doesn't actually want to like, have real conversations with you, have a real heart to heart. Chapter 24, again, still in Africa, but it starts with a very interesting 2 paragraphs that I'm willing to read verbatim. It goes, "As a royal, you were always taught to maintain a buffer zone between you and the rest of creation. Even working a crowd, you always kept a discreet distance between yourself and them. Distance was right, distance was safe, distance was survival. Distance was an essential bit of being royal, no less than standing on the balcony, waving to the crowds outside Buckingham Palace, your family all around you." Which, again, Harry is like so close to hitting the nail on the head here of the sort of anti-monarchist sentiment, and he just doesn't seem to go there. But what he's describing is, right, this sort of like mystical, divine power granted to monarchy, right? This idea of like, you are different from the rest of everybody else in the world, and there's a distance there because you and your family are considered superior. I don't think that our political system, our social systems, our economic systems, or whatever, should ever believe that any human beings are intrinsically superior or inferior to other people. And he says that distance was an essential bit of being royal. It's an essential bit of being in the monarchy, but he doesn't seem to be able to make that connection between it's an essential bit of the monarchy, but it's bad, therefore the monarchy shouldn't exist. Again, I really hope he does some soul searching and actually like snaps, like, you wrote it down. You're just not making the connections, buddy, He continues, "Of course, family included distance as well. No matter how much you might love someone, you could never cross that chasm between, say, monarch and child, or heir and spare, physically, but also emotionally. It wasn't just Willie's edict about giving him space. The older generation maintained a nearly zero tolerance prohibition on all physical contact. No hugs, no kisses, no pats. Now and then, maybe a light touch of cheeks on special occasions." And it's, again, he's so good at making that connection between, oh, so the monarchy is bleeding into our family dynamic, and this is toxic as fuck. You should never have a feeling that, yes, of course, there has to be some distance between a parent and a child, right? There has to be some responsibilities of older people to take care of younger people like children, right? There has to be some distance in that way. There needs to be some maintaining of authority. But to feel him say, you might love somebody and yet you're just not allowed to cross that chasm, right? You're not allowed that physical contact. You're not allowed to show that love in your family. It's messed up, right? You should feel like you can show your family in a myriad of different ways your emotions and your emotions for that other person. Continues by saying, but in Africa, none of this was true. In Africa, distance dissolved, all creatures mingled freely. And I think, again, this summarizes exactly why Africa and Botswana and Harry's relationship to going there and the people that he meets there and stuff was so powerful for him. It felt like it was his first experience with all of those barriers, all of that stuffiness, all of that emotional suppression finally dissolving away, melting away. And how freeing that would be if you feel like you've been holding on so tightly to your emotions. You can't even, again, like he said, no hugs, no kisses, no pats. Imagine you're not allowed to hug your father, your mother, your brother. Well, obviously he's hugged his mother, but you're not allowed to feel that warmth. It would drive me nuts. Like, listen, I'm not like a hugely like physical, feely, touchy person, but like I still like to hug my loved ones. I still like to feel physical intimacy with other people. I think we get the sense that Harry really starts to put that feeling of, I get to be physically intimate here. I get to be open here. I get to express my emotions here. He equates that to Africa because that's the only place where he feels like he is allowed to express those things. And so, yeah, we can talk about, yeah, this colonial myth, blah, blah, blah. But if you were in his position, like, what are you gonna do? Like, the only place where you can like find like true emotional security, far away from home, right? At the end of this chapter is also the first time or maybe the second time, he does mention smoking weed at Eton. Like, can you say you're surprised? I don't know who would be. I went to a pretty upscale school too. For some reason, weed's always associated with like lower class, low income, low class, black and brown people, you know, for all sorts of racist reasons. Rich white kids smoke the most weed. Like, it's true. But like my high school, it's those rich white kids smoking a ton of weed. The reason why I mention this is because at the end of this chapter, he's still in Africa. He mentions that he smells marijuana in the air as they're like sitting around the campfire at night. He asks to try it. Everyone acts like, ooh, like, you really? Like, Harry, you're gonna smoke some weed? He says to them, no, I'm quite experienced. I know what I'm doing. And you know, I think we've all been in that position as a teenager where we're like, actually, like, I'm a cool kid too. Like, I know how to smoke the marijuana, you know? And they give him a joint. He smokes it. He takes a puff. He's coughing up a storm. He realizes they just gave him some basil. Or basil, I should say. Quite a humorous story. I'm kind of skipping over a lot of like the humor of this book too. I feel kind of bad. There's definitely humorous points. This is one humorous story. Obviously, I'm getting to like all the deep, serious stuff and like trying to have serious conversations. But this book is actually quite funny too. I just want to mention. Chapters 25 and 26, I think, are crucial in that they are some of the much needed context for the later chapter that was leaked before the book came out, that's been endlessly talked about on the news, which is the allegations later on in the book that Prince William physically assaulted Prince Harry, caused him physical injuries, broke his necklace. You know, like, I heard the media at the time, a lot of people, again, just dismissing this part as, you know, well, brothers get into physical fights all the time. Brothers have scuffles all the time. Boys will be boys, essentially, was the argument. Never mind the fact that this was an incident that was allegedly between two 30-year-old grown men. In chapters 45 and 46, we see that there is an acknowledgement from Harry that it is normal for siblings, young brothers or young siblings, to fight, physically fight. He's not denying that in the book. So again, for all the media that's going through that, saying like, yeah, brothers get into little scuffles all the time, Harry totally acknowledges that in his book. He's not denying that it's common for young boys to fight and scuffle with each other. In chapter 25, he discusses how they used to go to Hugh and Emily's house and play with their children, and they would definitely get into physical altercations there. They would be roughhousing, they would be knocking each other down, they would be throwing Roman candles at each other. Like, obviously they did a lot of unsafe play. Listen, I'm not their parents. Like, I don't know. Personally, I wouldn't allow this kind of behavior between, my kids, but that's just me though. They talk about specifically like shooting at each other, like with actual like BB guns. And then in 26, we actually get a discussion of Willie and Harry turning on each other in the backseat of a car, throwing blows at each other. Charles turns to William, shouts at him to get out of the car. And it's funny, it ends with the last two paragraphs. Willie turned to me furious. He felt I got away with everything. He stepped out of the car, stomped to the backup car with all the bodyguards, strapped himself in. We always wore seatbelts after Mummy's disappearance. The convoy resumed. Now and then I peered out the back window. Behind us, I could just make out the future King of England plotting his revenge. I think this little story really illustrates this idea that William probably felt like Harry got away with everything because he was the spare, and so he was kind of labeled and cast out as like, well, he's the naughty one. He's gonna do crazy things. He does all this stupid stuff, but you, William, you have to be the responsible one. You have to be the serious one. You can't be getting into this. You can't be getting into scuffles, right? You have to be perfect. That's why this sort of dynamic between siblings where you have sort of a golden child and a scapegoat can also be harmful for the golden child, because the golden child feels like they always have to be perfect, and they feel like they're always punished or chastised when they're not perfect, but then feel like maybe that their younger sibling isn't always chastised for not being perfect because the expectations for that scapegoat are so low that they're almost treated like, who cares what happens to them? And so we can kind of see why William also probably has a lot of baggage in feeling that he needs to always do the right thing, which is what his parents tell him to do. Or sorry, what Charles tells him to do. How he always has to be the good boy, and how that could breed some resentment between William and Harry. How that might not necessarily be William's fault, because William, again, is a young person at this time. His family, his parents, the adults in his life, they are the ones that should have been responsible for making sure that both boys did not feel like they were put in these positions. We can see here that maybe the adults in their lives didn't necessarily handle everything well, and that, again, these things build up and build up and build up until you have very, very toxic dynamics. Going into chapter 27, we get a lot of discussions of hunting, talked more about like different types of teachers. I don't think that he mentions these sort of hunting trips to flex on anyone or say hunting is great or whatever, but he uses them a lot of times as opportunities to discuss, again, different teachers in his life and learning life lessons. And in this chapter, 27, which is actually relatively long for some of the chapters, he talks about a man named Sandy who was sort of a teacher, a mentor in his life, who taught him how to stalk and hunt. He talks about Sandy being this like deeply masculine Scottish figure, takes his hunting very seriously, who knows the ins and outs of how to stalk and how to disembowel, and teaches him this sort of like sacred ritual almost of the kill. So during the chapter, Sandy pushes his head into a carcass in what he calls a blooding. There seems to be this sort of ritual that after a hunt, you're meant to like put blood on your face or blood yourself as some sort of like ritual in the kill. Sounds disgusting. And actually like I'm glad this isn't my life, but he seems to have taken something good out of it, so good for him. But he says at the end, I wasn't religious, but this blood facial was to me baptismal. Pa was deeply religious, he prayed every night, but now in this moment I too felt close to God. If you loved nature, Pa always said, you had to know when to leave it alone and when to manage it, and managing meant culling and culling meant killing. It was all a form of worship. They mention this as well, this idea of like the whole royal family has this deep obsession with hunting and this deep obsession with going stalking, going shooting, killing, being surrounded by killing animals and death of animals, but that they love nature and that they believe that there's something sacred and you love nature and therefore you have to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, you know, for some reason, but that there's always this option on the table to, like he said, managing meant culling and culling meant killing. It seems to show in the royal family again, the dichotomy that's always created, that either leave something alone or you go for the kill. And never does there seem to be a sort of middle ground here. And if you think about it in relation to how Charles thinks about the press, right? Either don't read it, dear boy, or you go for the kill and you kill the story, or you manipulate the story, or you plant the story, and it gets you closer to God. I think there's a lot in there about how the monarchy operates. Throughout the entire first part of this book, Harry is still in denial that his mother is dead. He always talks about her as having disappeared, as having escaped or run away, being in hiding. He's always in denial that she is actually dead, and he is always wondering when she's going to come back for him, take him out of his life, and then they can escape together. Heartbreaking that he seemed to believe that for like 8, 9, 10 years of his life. Like desperately clung on to this hope of his mother coming and rescuing him. He shares this theory with William. It says he admitted that he once entertained a similar theory, but ultimately he discarded it. She's gone, Harold. She's not coming back. Again, I know that William is like going through his own trauma, but if that is what he said, I mean, that's still pretty harsh to say to your little brother. But then again, Charles needed to get them both in therapy, so I don't blame either of them. He says, no, I wouldn't hear such a thing. Willie, she always said she wanted to just disappear. You heard her. Yes, she did, but Harold, she'd never do this to us. I'd had the very same thought, I told him, but she wouldn't die either, Willie. She'd never do that to us either. Fair point, Harold. And I think that's an even more tricky process with grief like this, especially when it's the death of a parent. The feeling that you always feel this intense grief for your dead parent, but I think there's also comes with that a lot of anger in this feeling of, how could they do this to me? How could the universe do this to me? How could God or the world or whatever you believe in, how could this happen to me? And when he says that, but she wouldn't die either, Willie, she'd never do that to us, it's so heartbreaking because as a parent, I'm sure you would never in a million years want to leave your child in this state. As a parent, and you know that Diana would be thinking this, you know, up at the pearly gates, she would never want to have her children feel like she abandoned them, right? There's almost this anger at the abandonment, even when it's not that parent's fault. We will see over the course of the book that this anger comes more and more and more. And obviously it comes more and more as Harry starts to let go of that denial that his mother is dead and starts to fully reconcile and comprehend that she is no longer there. And once he recognizes that she's dead, that anger can come in full force. We cut to Balmoral, summer 2021. They discuss having a nice little family get together. He said his granny's specialty was a salad dressing that she made personally, which is interesting. I would have never thought ever in a million years that anybody in the royal family knew how to cook at all. His grandpa, his Prince Philip and Granny, both cooking things. So that was kind of a cute moment. He also makes mention of his Gan, that's the queen mom. He talks about having a connection to Gan, speaking to her this evening. He says he doesn't remember specifically what they talked about, but that he really wishes that he had had more conversations, more intense conversations with her, considering that she lived through such a crazy time in the royal family, becoming queen, which she never expected to be, living in Buckingham Palace during the war, meeting Churchill. And we'll see this. He also mentions something similar when he talks about his Aunt Margaret. Throughout the book, we see this same theme. Harry is looking for family. He's looking for connection. He's looking for people who relate to him, relate to his experiences. And he feels like he never got to have those like deep, thoughtful conversations with all these people that he could have really related to. But again, that coldness, that lack of emotion, that lack of connection, he didn't get to make those kinds of connections all the time. Everyone's off in their own little world. He specifically mentions having a cute moment talking to his Gan, so the queen mom, about Ali G, who was very popular on British television at the time. Jump to chapter 30, 9/11 happens. It's basically the same 9/11 story that anyone at the time probably had. Seeing the Twin Towers on the screen, our world was forever changed. However, again, life goes on, school continues. He's back at Eton. He starts talking about smoking weed out a bathroom window with his Eton buddies. Now we get a little bit more into the sort of Club H days. Chapter 33, we set up this idea of Club H. Now, Club H was sort of a basement at Highgrove, which is where him and his father and stuff, I think they all lived at Highgrove. It was called Club H for Club Highgrove, Club H, not for Club Harry, he says. Basically, Club H was William and Harry's sort of man cave. And this, honestly, this part of their life seems to be like the closest that they ever got to being like just normal brothers that had like normal friends, shared relationships, shared experiences together. This seems to be like the moment in their life where they were like the closest together. He basically talked about this was their hangout. They would invite their friends over. Keep in mind again, they are two princes. They can't just be going out to the club every night, especially they're underage, right? They're still at Eton. The times when they have the most amount of fun, they have to ensure intense privacy. And so hanging out their house deep in the basement of Highgrove is like the only place where they can kind of ensure a little bit of privacy. He talks about them drinking a lot, having some smoochies, listening to Fatboy Slim. Then suddenly Marco comes to Harry at Eton and pulls him aside, and I will read the excerpt for you. What's up, Marco? I've been asked to find out the truth, Harry. About what? Now, pause for a second. One, this scene, I swear to God, plays out exactly like the scene from Meet the Parents that I played in my last video about the Circle of Trust.
Then is there something you want to tell me?
It's always manipulative and weird when people want to come to you to have a serious talk, and then they just come to you and are like, I just want to find out the truth. Like, no explanation of what the truth is that they're searching for. Here he goes on, he says, I suspected he was referring to my recent loss of virginity. Now, everybody has heard this part of the story. It's been one of these juicy excerpts that's been plastered all over the media, all of the internet. It says, inglorious episode with an older woman. She liked horses quite a lot and treated me not unlike a young stallion. Quick ride, after which she'd smacked my rump and sent me off to graze. Among the many things about it that were wrong, it happened in a grassy field behind a busy pub. Now, it's baffling to me, okay? It is baffling to me that the internet is like taking this so out of context. Let me do some quick mental maths here. Harry was born in 1984. In this part of the story, we're in 2001. His birthday is sometime in September. I can't remember exactly. Harry has just turned 17. He has just turned 17. Like, he has barely turned 17. And he refers in this one paragraph. Also, keep in mind, okay, in the context of a whole book, Harry has no problem talking about embarrassing experiences. We'll get into that later. He has no problem talking about embarrassing experiences, talking about his relationships. He talks about his other girlfriends, and yet the loss of his virginity is in this one paragraph. Harry is 17, and he says that it was an inglorious episode with an older woman. Immediately, as a reader, instead of mocking him, alarm bells should be going off in your head. Harry is describing a statutory assault. An older woman behind a pub, so we can assume that potentially alcohol was involved. He describes it as a quick ride, and then she smacked my rump and sent me off to graze. Obviously, I don't think he meant that literally she like smacked his butt or whatever, but the implication of this scene is that this woman used him for sex and then discarded him. I mean, she's not named, she's not referenced. It doesn't sound like this is a woman that he knew or like had a relationship with in any other way. And so this paragraph, to me, obviously reads as a young man talking about sexual violence. This is not a haha funny, oh, why is Harry talking about this embarrassing story, losing his virginity? This is assault. He's a 17-year-old boy. He describes it as an older woman. He doesn't say another teenager. He doesn't say a college girl or whatever. Even if you wanted to like claim, okay, this person was like, okay, he's 17 and this woman maybe was like 18, 19. Maybe it's not a big deal, the age difference or whatever. He specifically chose the words older woman, and he says specifically, among the many things about it that were wrong, he specifically mentions that this sexual encounter was wrong. Not embarrassing, wrong. And yet people want to make fun of this paragraph. And I think that that's just so sad that men can't have their assaults treated with respect or even treated as assaults. It seems like people don't recognize this or read this as an assault. Imagine this was written by a woman describing herself as a 17-year-old girl. Speaking about their first sexual experience, you would say, that was an assault. Something bad happened to you. That wasn't right. And nobody seems to be saying that. Men should be believed. So that's not what Marco is trying to ask him about. He says, the truth, Marco, about whether or not you're doing drugs, Harry. He says that there's some tabloid is claiming that they have pictures, that they have evidence. He swears to Marco up and down, no, I'm not doing drugs. He's pretty sure that they're just fishing for information. Think about it from the tabloid's perspective, all right? What do you want to bet you pick any normal teenager on the fucking planet and they're doing some kind of drug? It's pretty high, especially a teenager that you know has trauma. I mean, if you're the tabloid, yeah, you could probably just lie and be like, hey, yeah, I think Harry's doing drugs, and you'd probably be right. So he basically tells Marco to call their bluff. But no, they don't want to correct the record. They don't want to say that that's lies. Instead, they go with the PR move of making Harry take the fall by claiming that he's, drug addicted and all messed up, so that they can spin the story and create a narrative in the press, with the palace being complicit in it, that Charles is being the doting father dealing with his drug-addled son, so that Charles gets to look good, while sacrificing Harry's reputation, portraying him as this drug-addled monster. Now that there's this wild spinning tale about Harry doing drugs, and at this point, it seems like his only real connection to drugs is maybe smoking weed out of the Eton bathroom, but he swears up and down that they didn't actually do drugs at Club H. They never smoked down there or did any hard drugs down there or whatever. At least at this time period. I can't remember if that comes up later in the book. But he says at this time, they're basically, they might be drinking a little bit down there, but for British teenagers, like, that's pretty common. But somehow the media narrative has latched onto this idea of Harry being drug addicted and have started to put out this lie that Harry has been to rehab. Again, completely spinning him into this like out of control, fucked up kid. It's very much, and it's funny because this is happening in the early 2000s, right? It's very much reminiscent of the media narrative against like these former Disney stars that started popping up in the early 2000s. They're drug addicted, they're in rehab, they're going, and all that sort of like salacious celebrity gossip that was really destructive, right? For like your Lindsay Lohan types and Britney Spears, Nicole Richie, I guess, to a certain extent. It plants this idea in people's minds. He mentions giving a tour to somebody around the house who asked to go see Club H. Who clearly had read about Club H in the papers, how she walked in and said, "Oh, it even smells of weed." And as someone who like knows a lot of people that don't know what weed smells like, this is funny to me because I think a lot of times people that aren't around weed a lot or don't smoke a lot of weed are always like smelling things in the air and being like, "Oh, it's weed," but it's just the smell of like fresh, like grass or fresh, like anything that smells vaguely herbal or vaguely natural, organic, sometimes gets mistaken for smelling like weed. And so it's funny that he mentions that, but it also shows again how as much as the royal family wants to say, don't read this, nobody reads this, nobody believes these things, again, gaslighting, people clearly do believe these things, and it clearly influences how they perceive Harry and the environment and the world. Because again, she's smelling weed when it's not there because that idea has been implanted in her by the media. Oh my God, holy crap. Okay, we gotta speed through this. There's so much to discuss. There's so much in here. We entered into chapter 35. Harry starts to talk about two people around this time that pass away. One is Princess Margaret, which I kind of talked before, that he feels kind of bad for not having a stronger relationship with her because she realizes that they would have been both spares and maybe both would have had a similar story, which I agree with, having watched The Crown. And he also mentions Gan-Gan, the Queen Mother, being on her last legs around this time. He doesn't really remark much on Gan-Gan. He basically is like, yeah, she was a nice old lady. Again, what mostly seems to upset him about these experiences is that it's another reminder of death in his family. He has to relive that trauma of his mother dying. He specifically mentions the Koh-i-Noor diamond, and he says, in quotation marks, acquired by the British Empire at its zenith, stolen, some thought. He mentions the Koh-i-Noor because it's on the crown that is sitting on his Gan-Gan's coffin. And I like that he specifically points out that the Koh-i-Noor was stolen by the British Empire. Again, why are you not an anti-monarchist, Harry? Like, your story, you seem to have some sort of recollection that the British Empire and the monarchy has stolen things from its previous empire. And yet he just doesn't go that little bit further to condemn monarchy itself. Then we get to the Golden Jubilee. Around this Jubilee time, Marco comes to Harry again and confronts Harry about drugs and asks if Harry is doing cocaine. Harry fervently denies this to Marco. Marco says that there is a tabloid that is claiming to have a picture of him snorting a line of coke. Again, any sort of tabloid can easily say, oh, I assume that, you know, a teenage boy is doing some sort of drugs and maybe I can pretend that I have that information because, you know, the sky is blue. Teenagers typically do drugs. Harry pretty much right away assumes that this is a setup. The tabloids don't have any pictures of him doing coke. And so he fervently denies it. He tells Marco to deny it. He says, don't play these stupid games. They don't have a picture. And it sounds like maybe this is typical, but this is a little bit concerning that the British media seems to be consistently trying to blackmail the royal family into giving them stories or details by claiming to have more information than they actually do. They almost seem like the police, you know, like how police can lie to you about the amount of evidence that they have legally and can tell you that they know things that they don't actually know or have seen evidence that they haven't actually seen, hoping to get a confession? It seems like the press plays this game a lot. He says, of course, I had been doing cocaine around this time at someone's country house during a shooting weekend. I'd been offered a line and I'd done a few more since. He had tried cocaine a couple of times. He said that he did it because he wanted to feel different. Again, this is someone that seems to be experimenting with drugs because of trauma, this wanting to get away, feel different, feel something else than the pain that they're feeling in their reality. So he does not seem to be glamorizing or glorifying any of the drugs that he's said that he's partaken in, especially cocaine. He says that the risk far outweighed the reward. So any hard drugs really that he tends to mention in the text, he's very clear that he doesn't advocate people just do them recreationally. Even when he does advocate for certain things, like he clearly seems fine with weed, but like who isn't? Like in this day and age, like weed, like we know that it's not harmful. And even when he mentions his experimentation with psychedelics and stuff, he has said on the record that he doesn't believe people should be doing those kind of things just purely for recreational use, but he does recognize that there is some evidence coming out that psychedelics can be helpful in treatments related to PTSD or other sort of traumas. And so I think that any reference that Harry has made to drugs in the book, he has been pretty responsible in explaining that he's not advocating for people to drown their sorrows in drugs and alcohol. He's not painting it as a fun time in his life, you know? He's just saying it happened. It's true. He did it. We get to the actual Golden Jubilee. Not too much interesting about that. The one thing that is interesting is that he says that his granny was wearing earplugs during the Jubilee. He found that very funny. I think that's also very funny too, but it also makes total sense. Like an old lady with probably her ears have been shot out through like tons and tons of appearances and crowd screaming and stuff like that. She gotta protect her hearing. Makes sense. Chapter 38 is where we get to discussions about what the boys are gonna do with their future after Eton. At this point in time, Will is at St. Andrews. Whole fucking video about that if you want to look into my thoughts on William at St. Andrews and tying it into the Harry and Meghan story and all that shit. But it seems like William already kind of had his path set out with that. Now it was time for them to sort of figure out what Harry was going to do with his life. Again, imagine you as a young person in the royal family have basically no options. You can't work any regular jobs. Your options are go to university to study something that they'll probably not let you do. The William route. What the hell is he doing with his geography degree? You can join the military, and even if you join the military, it seems unlikely that they will allow you to do it without jumping through all of these hoops, which we'll see later on in the book. Or you can just sit still, look pretty. I don't wanna sit still, look pretty. Sit around and do fuck all. And that's what they do. And those seem to be your three future career choices. Charles asks Harry what he wants to do. He says specifically that he had dreamed of working at a fondue hut near a ski resort that they often went to. And I like that sort of like little dream of like a young person that's like, I want to work at like the best shop in the world or the best restaurant in the world. I've definitely been there as a young kid. He then floats the idea of becoming a ski instructor, and his father says it's out of the question. Again, why? As a royal family member, why couldn't you become a ski instructor? But again, it's just they have such a narrow concept of what the royals are allowed to do, and it's just nothing is good enough for what they envision that the royal family should be doing. But what they're doing is like not typically useful. Like what a sad, pathetic existence that is. But anyway, he then says safari guide, again, that connection to Africa and wanting to be in Africa and be free, right? He gets told no, which again, why? Wouldn't that be so cool if there was a young royal that was doing something like safari guides? Maybe did documentaries about animals? Like, why are they not able to think outside of the box for what royals can do? Like, there are other royal families in Europe, like, where the young royals have jobs. Aren't there, like, some Danish royals that are, like, models and stuff? I'm sure if Harry went to his father and said, I want to be a fashion model, he would be like, out of the question. But it's like, at least they have, like, a job that makes it seem like they're a regular person and not sitting on their ass all day. It goes back to an elitist thing, right? People of the upper classes don't need jobs. And so they're basically discouraged from having any useful jobs that would make the world a better place. I also like that he makes a reference here. He said, part of me wanted to drop out, disappear as Mummy did, and other princes. Wasn't there one in India a long time ago? A bloke who just walked out of the palace and sat under a lovely banyan tree? That's a reference to the Buddha. Wouldn't that would be a real fucking twist to the tale if Prince Harry became the next Buddha. I think we should, I think that's definitely a career decision. He also conveys that his father specifically said to him that he wasn't cut out for university, that he didn't seem to be the family scholar. And again, just rude. Like, there are many university paths, but again, these people don't know what proper education looks like. There are plenty of degrees out there, plenty of ways to pursue tertiary education that don't require you to be like the family scholar, whatever the fuck that means. I think Harry is very thoughtful and would do very well in certain degrees. But again, it's out of the question for him to pursue anything outside of this very, 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 very narrow window of what it means to have a royal profession. With all of those ideas eliminated, he finally settles on the idea of joining the army. It says, Pa smiled. Yes, darling boy, the army sounds just like the thing. And part of it, a lot of this just rings very conniving, because it's like, really, that's the only thing that he could do. And for his father to be like, the army sounds like just the thing. It's like, if you say no to every single other option, I don't think you should go to university. I don't think you should be a ski instructor. I don't think you should be a safari guide. I don't think you should do this. I don't think you should do that. The only option is going to be the military. And how fucking sick is that? I'm very, very critical of the military, and I don't like that the military preys on people that feel like they have very limited options. And it feels like his father preyed on him by basically giving him no other option than to be in the military. And I don't think that's good. I think that's no bueno. But before he goes to the military, he decides to go on a gap year. This one time on my gap year.
Yeah, I can't believe you said that, because that really reminds me of this time on my gap year.
William had already gone on his gap year before he went to St. Andrews, and it apparently was life-changing. That's not mentioned in the book. I just know that from my brain because it's full of Prince William knowledge. They decide that he's first going to go on a farm in Australia for half the year, and then he's going to go back to Africa to work for AIDS charities, specifically to go to Lesotho. Harry's best friend, Henners, who has been mentioned throughout the book, is also planning to go to Africa, but he will be going to Uganda. So he and Henners make plans that they're gonna meet up at some point in Africa. However, Harry gets the news right around Christmas of 2022 that Henners has passed away in a car accident. Trauma, right? So not only has this poor boy lost his mother in a car crash, he has lost who he states in the book is his best friend to a car crash. It's very tragic. Everyone treats it as a huge shock. I think that this also becomes one of the defining points where Harry starts to realize that his mother might genuinely be gone. He doesn't seem to have that same sort of denial that Henners is gone, because there isn't that situation of him saying that he wants to escape or whatever, like his mother. I think that this situation starts to solidify in Harry's mind that his mother is well and truly gone. 39 and 40 is getting to the end of Harry's time at Eton. He's forced to act in a play. He's in Much Ado About Nothing because, again, Eton has no fucking repertoire for their curriculum. They just do Shakespeare forever. Again, quality education or just traditional. He does focus on an interesting story where his father laughs at all the wrong moments while he's on stage, and he thinks that he's embarrassing him, and his father doesn't realize that he's done it, but then relays that his father did the same thing to him. I think that this is a great demonstration of how we can perpetuate generational issues without realizing it. It also demonstrates that Charles is like so clueless as to how his like traumas and his problems might also be happening to other people. I think that that's interesting that Charles, like, for someone whose whole story, especially in his reform image, is that he fell in love with a woman that he couldn't be with, and he did everything in his power to be with her again. Like, for the fact that he's so blinded, like he can't see that in other human beings, like Harry, for example, who also fell in love and is fighting to be with the love of his life. Like, it just shows that these people are so clueless. They're so self-absorbed, and they can't see how other people might be in the same positions as they are. I think that's called empathy. I don't know. But I think this is a clear example of how maybe he doesn't do these sorts of things intentionally, but he is definitely oblivious and clueless to other people's perspectives. And that's why the monarchy is bad, because it makes people like this that have no fucking self-awareness whatsoever. On his gap year, Harry is finally in Australia. He goes to this farm. There's lots of descriptions. Again, Harry seems to love going to these very remote places away from the city life, away from the press. That freedom and connecting it to these sort of wild places and very remote places seems to have affected his life personally, and he seems to be always trying to seek out those kind of places to truly like discover himself, you know? A lot of these chapters here are talking about just the labor around the farm, working with the owners of the farm. He talks about George, who he works with on the farm, who again acts as another sort of teacher in his life, a mentor, a father figure to him, teaching him how to herd cows, teaching him about farm life. To be honest, this part of the book is like a little bit, this is where the book starts to drag a little bit, but again, you get a sense of like the how much Harry enjoys that monotonous day-to-day work. He doesn't come off as someone who is afraid to get dirty, to work hard, to do difficult labor, manual labor. He feels most comfortable there because he associates it with these remote locations where he gets to feel free. And he gets to meet these characters that really play a teacher figure, a mentor figure, or a parental figure in his life. And you can tell that he just so desperately needs it. But of course, the press yet again ruins it for him. They discover his location, they out his location, he starts getting papped, people start breaking into the farm. Harry essentially has to leave early because he doesn't want the farm owners to go through all the paparazzi and all the media attention. So after 9 weeks in Australia, he heads back to the United Kingdom. This is where we start getting into the going out to the clubs and that sort of party boy image that he got. He mentions going out to the club and hitting it off with a woman who was a page 3 girl, which is, you know, the topless women in the sun, which again just does not exist in the United States. I've seen this in the UK, but this is just not a thing. We don't have topless women in newspapers that you can just buy off the street. The UK really is like, their tabloids are trash. Like way more trash than the US. Way more trash. Of course, we see anytime that Harry tries to bond with a woman, the paps basically chase her out of his life. So this poor woman, chased out of his life, is used in the narrative to embarrass Harry. He's like, fuck it, whatever. He goes on a plane to Lesotho. Harry makes reference to a interview that he did in Lesotho, his first ever solo interview with a reporter. His response, he mentions, was very disjointed and clearly still grieving and still full of trauma. He states,
Mum particularly used her global fame to draw attention particularly to the problem of AIDS. I mean, do you think about her a lot through something like this? Is she in your mind when you're doing it?
Definitely, as I was asked the same questions. when it was the anniversary. Exactly the same answer. I've always wanted to do this. It's okay. It's completely. It is what she was doing. What I started off with going to Great Ormond Street and all this sort of stuff. It was very. I'm only 19, and there's a half of me. There's a lot of me that wants to say, right, it's now time to follow on, or as much as I can, try and keep my mother's legacy going. But at the age of 19, it's pretty hard work, especially as I try and be as normal as I can and have, a normal life before it gets too hectic. But back in England, I think it's completely different as to out here. And she never came to Lesotho, I don't think, but she's worked around the same areas. And I don't know, I believe I got a lot of my mother in me, basically. And I think she'd want us to do this, me and my brother. And obviously it's not as easy for William as it is for me. I think I've got more time on my hands to be able to help, whereas William's we've both got our life set out, but I think he's got his life really set out. So I just,
The king, I guess, is quite time-consuming. But you clearly are actively considering your mother when you're doing this. Obviously, it's a parallel that can be taken too far. I mean, is it partly about just, we constantly get, of course, all the stuff that we know about coming back and back and back. Is part of this a conscious attempt to just remind people of all the good that she did do?
Well, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's been a long time now. Not for me, but for most people, it's been a long time since she died. But the stuff that's come out has been bad. All the stuff that's come out has been all these tapes and everything. And luckily, I've been out here, so I haven't really heard about it. But I feel bad because my father and my brother have been taking the stick instead. But it's just a shame that after all the good she's done, even this far on, people can't bring out the good in her. They can't remember the good. They can remember the good, most people can, but no name is mentioned, but there's people who all they want to bring out is the bad stuff. Bad news sells. Simple as that. And I'm not out here to try and change that, but I'm out here doing what I want to do, doing what I think she'd want me to do. And it's not a question of reminding everyone what good she did, because everyone knows that, hopefully.
Which again is like trauma alert. It's not been a long time for me. This is only about this is in 2004. We're about 6-7 years now, and he's still, it's so fresh to him. You can say it's not been a long time for him since she died, and he can't really seem to wrap his mind around it. He mentions that he was surprised that he was the first of him and William to speak openly about their mom after she had passed. He even at the time is thinking to himself, how is this going to go down with everybody? And in italics, it says, "Not well," Marco told me later. Pa was dead set against me addressing that topic. He didn't want either of his sons speaking about Mummy for fear it would cause a stir, distract from his work, and perhaps shine an unflattering light on Camilla. How messed up is that? Your child goes on camera and talks about his dead mother, and you are worried about how bad you're gonna look and how bad Camilla is gonna look? I know that Charles isn't reported as saying this directly to Harry, but how fucked up is that? It's been like 6-7 years and your child's mother died and you don't want him to ever talk about it. What? Just what? Like that's the closest so far in the book that we've ever seen, that we've gotten to like a glimpse of Charles being psycho. Like that is, you do not have empathy or understanding of other human beings' emotions. If you would turn that whole situation around to make it about you and your wife. During his gap year, Harry decides to go from Lesotho to Cape Town, and while he is there, he meets a girl named Chelsea, his first big news girlfriend. He says what attracted him to Chelsea was that she seemed different. She didn't seem that interested in appearances, with royalty, with all of that fluff. And he says specifically, unlike so many girls I met, she wasn't visibly fitting herself for a crown the moment she shook my hand. How hard is it to enter the dating market when you feel like most of the people that you meet are just looking to become royalty. They're just looking for some money, for some prestige, for some clout. But he was glad that he found somebody that didn't seem interested in that. And Chelsea becomes one of the first women that he can truly see himself being with, that they seem to have this connection. He also liked that she seemed not only just uninterested with the royal aspect, but seemed almost bored by it. And I think that that's interesting too, because I think that speaks to Harry also in some ways being bored by the royal aspect as well. Because they hit it off so well, Harry invites Chelsea to go with them the next day to Botswana. While they're in Botswana, they meet two people that seem to be the most like parental figures for Harry in the whole book. And they're brought up repeatedly, and you can tell that these two people really guided him throughout his whole life. His daddy wasn't there for him, you know? Like, Charles was not here for him, but these two, Tige and Mike, they were here for Harry, and they really parented him in a positive, gentle, responsible way. Charles should send these two like a Christmas present every year or something, because these two stepped up when he didn't do shit. Harry meets Tige and Mike because they're two filmmakers working on documentaries in Botswana. Mike specifically says that they can come with him if they are willing to do some work. And as we've seen before, Harry loves that manual labor. He loves just being out there in nature, in the wild, doing shit. Not for me, but he enjoys it because he associates it with freedom. Tige and Mike also become Harry's sort of like first look at a healthy relationship built on love. It's the first couple, not only that is able to become like parental figures for him, but that can also model like a healthy relationship, because obviously his parents didn't have that. He asked them about how they met, how their relationship seemed to just be fate, that they had these common interests, that they clearly were both fascinated by wildlife. There's even a story about Tige going to Mike's apartment for the first time and seeing a book that her grandfather wrote on his bookshelf, and saw that all of her favorite books were arranged in exactly the same order on his shelf as they were on her shelf. So we get this sense that their relationship is also modeling for Harry what he wants out of a relationship. This like electric love, this devotion of two people living their life together, doing something that they're passionate about, doing something that they love, and taking that journey together. And I can tell from the book that he is like eternally grateful for them being these great role models in his life. Chelsea and Harry arrive back in the United Kingdom. They get papped. I think it's one of the first times that Chelsea herself has ever gotten papped. Harry notes that there had been a few years after his mom died that there weren't these sort of like pap surprises. But he says now it was constant. As the boys are getting older, that those previous agreements that they had while they were in school are starting to disappear. And again, more about some of those things in my first video. After that, Harry is concerned that this is going to chase Chelsea away. But he also kind of realizes that since he's going to be going off to the army soon, that maybe he's not in the right space for a relationship, but he still really likes Chelsea, and they can't seem to really stay away from each other. He actually specifically mentions, the army was looking for lads like me. What's that you say, young man? Parents divorced? Mom's dead? Unresolved grief or psychological trauma? Step this way. And I'm so glad that Harry points this out, because again, like I said before, the army specifically recruits and tries to get people that are in these vulnerable positions. Now we get to chapter 48. Prince Charles asks the Queen for permission to marry Camilla. William and Harry are still frustrated by this. They still don't want Charles to marry Camilla, but they recognize now love is love. This guy he loves her. What are we gonna do about it? And the boys still have sympathy for the situation between their father and Camilla, because they do recognize that they both are truly in love. But them getting married becomes all sorts of issues because, one, Prince Charles can't officially marry and would have to do a civil ceremony because he can't marry in the Church of England if he's marrying a divorcee. So then they have to figure out where they're going to get married. Then the Pope died. And of course, they can't get married when the Pope died because press coverage.
They need the press coverage.
They want the positive publicity. So then they move the wedding again. Harry notes that he feels like this was some sort of like divine sign from Diana trying to block their marriage, and I think that's hilarious. The marriage for the boys definitely seems bittersweet. They definitely see that once Charles marries Camilla, he's going to be less and less around in their life, which is pretty fucked up again. Again, think if this was any other family, you would never think that it was healthy to see somebody get married to a new spouse and then pull away from their flesh and blood children that they brought into this world. It's not healthy. And this is where the line comes in where Harry says that he felt that Camilla had recently sacrificed him on her personal PR altar, which is absolutely true. But right after that phrase, he doesn't just immediately paint her as the villain. He says, "But I saw Pa's smile and it was hard to argue with that, and harder still to deny the cause. Camilla, I wanted so many things, but I was surprised to discover at their wedding that one of the things I wanted most still was for my father to be happy." So yes, he did have some complicated feelings about Camilla, and it was wrong for her to use Harry's bad reputation to bolster her own reputation. But that didn't mean that he didn't recognize that his father was in love with Camilla and that they clearly wanted to be together. And love is love, you know? So even when it's these two psychos, you know? Next, Harry talks about doing military exercises with his brother. And he mentions that, and this part was a real like, what? He mentions our family had always maintained close ties with the British military, obviously. Sometimes that meant an official visit, sometimes a casual lunch. Sometimes it meant a private chat with men and women home from the wars. But sometimes it meant taking part in rigorous exercises. Nothing showed respect for the military like doing or trying to do what they did. And he tells a story about doing one of these like secret military exercises, which, what the fuck? Like, I understand the connection between, you know, the monarchy and the military. The monarchy is part of the government, and the government has to, you know, support our troops, blah, blah, blah. Doing military exercises, but military exercises that aren't even like public ceremonies, but just private military exercises, for what? For what? It's very bizarre. And again, I have critiques of the military and their strategies and their recruitment tools and whatever. And so this part definitely was a little bit like, what? Why? But anyway, during one of these exercises, Harry injures his knee. The palace has to lie about it because it happened during a military exercise that wasn't public knowledge. So they say that Harry injured himself playing rugby. But of course, the press twists this narrative. Even though Harry was doing military exercises, which they didn't know at the time, they twist the narrative too. Harry doesn't want to go off to war, and he's trying to get out of his duties. He's a coward. As we see later in the book, Harry is a soldier for 10 years, and he has fought in combat. He has been close to death. This argument that he is some coward who didn't really do anything in the army, it's just ridiculous. It's just nonsense. Oh my god, we've got a couple more chapters left before we finish part 1. Let's go. Chapter 50. Harry wears the Nazi uniform. This part already leaked. This part of the story has already been covered. Will and Kate are supposedly the ones that told Harry to wear a Nazi uniform to a party that was themed natives and colonials, not to be confused with Will's 21st birthday party, which was themed out of Africa. When you're in these upper echelons, it seems like you can never have enough racist themed parties. So for this specific racist themed party, Harry checked in with Will and Kate about the outfit. This is our first real glimpse into Harry actually talking about Kate, and his first description of her is very positive, that he enjoyed her laugh. He enjoyed having fun with her. They got on well together. And so I think part of what we get here is that he chose this outfit to impress Will and Kate in some way. He said, maybe I thought I can make Kate laugh with my costume. We also get these glimpses that Harry is like desperately lonely. He's fantasizing about being with Chelsea or being with a girl and being together. And he sees Will and Kate having that relationship together, and he's like so desperate for a partner. Of course, snaps from the party come out. Paparazzi's all over it. The press is saying that Harry was stupid. He himself says, you know, what was I thinking here? He recognizes that he really fucked up in this moment. He's not shy about saying that he fucked up in this moment. He speaks to William about it. He speaks to his father about it. His father basically is like, yeah, you're a fucking idiot. He's like, yeah. But his father responds in a way that's, you know, quite parental, saying, you're still growing, you're still becoming, still learning, he said. And I think that's a positive way to look at it. And I feel like this was the first time Harry made a mistake and actually had like a life lesson out of it. Other times his mistakes seem to be like media orchestrated to make him look like he was in the worst possible light, just to throw him under the bus. But this seemed like an actual teachable, learnable moment. He made a mistake. He did something that is racist, that is anti-Semitic, and he felt bad about it. He started to understand why it was wrong. He recognized that, and he learns and grows from it. He goes to see the chief rabbi of Britain. He has a nice heart-to-heart. The rabbi, again, acting as a teacher, specifically tells Harry that it's not about feeling guilty about what he did. It's about learning and changing and growing and doing better. Always a great life lesson. Harry is about to go into the army. We're so close. 52. The boys get a new private secretary named JLP, Jamie Lowther Pinkerton. He's basically their new Marco. Harry asks JLP to show him the documents about his mother's death. At this point, Harry is still in that like semi-denial phase about his mother dying. And I think he wants to see these sort of documents to sort of prove to himself that she is really gone. JLP seems hesitant about this, but also realizes that maybe this will do some good for Harry. He gives him the documents. He says specifically that he didn't show him a lot of the things that were more graphic, but Harry does still see pictures of the crashed Mercedes looking into the back seat. He saw pictures of the lifeless body of Mummy's friend, Dodi Al-Fayed, and then he saw pictures of his mother. He notes in the pictures that it seemed like she was glowing, that she had this halo around her. He realizes that that glowing was all the flash bulbs from the cameras taking pictures of her while she was dying. And he really ruminates on this fact that, again, if the paparazzi were not doing what they were doing on that evening, his mother might just still be alive. Although he has this sort of understanding that the paparazzi has done bad things and he doesn't like the paparazzi, I think this is the first moment where it clicks to him that they are partially responsible for his mother's death and yet suffered no consequences for the role that they played in driving her to her death. He says, I hadn't been aware before this moment that the last thing Mummy saw on this earth was a flashbulb. Heartbreaking stuff. Although this starts to unlock something in Harry's brain, he does say at the end that he slammed the folder shut and said that she's in hiding. He still was definitely suppressing and denying that she was gone, but he's slowly, as he's getting older, is starting to reckon with the fact that she is no longer here, that she isn't going to come sweep him out of this life. With that, he heads off to boot camp for the army. He talks about how boot camp was all about degrading them, pushing them to their limits, treating them like dogs, breaking their spirit, belittling them. It's like a movie boot camp, right? It seems to be just old-fashioned dudes screaming at you. While he's at boot camp, While he's at boot camp, a reporter from The Sun sneaks onto their base with a fake bomb with some fake nonsense story about trying to expose how much danger Prince Harry was in because he was able to get a fake bomb onto the training grounds. Make it make sense, okay? Like, you can't be a burglar and then break into someone's house and say, actually, no, I was showing the people that I burgled that they would have easily been burgled. That's not how that works. Like, they do some more boot camp, they do some more running. Harry seems to love the sort of boot camp pushing his body to the limits, because that physical pain of pushing his body seems to distract from his emotional pain. Going to Brookwood Military Cemetery, above the church is etched in stone, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which any British student ever could tell you should be taken with a grain of salt, considering that there is a very famous World War I poem, and that poem specifically is meant to signify Dulce et decorum non est pro patria mori. And yet, no irony whatsoever he mentions. He mentions now they're getting into the training portion. That's all this book learning. And again, what kind of fucking military training is this? Why do you need to send soldiers out to Iraq and Afghanistan after they write essays about military strategy? What the fuck is this? Again, your education system is a mess. What's the goal? Prepare for that goal. Like, can I do some curriculum development here? Like, he talks about doing killing exercises, and he talks about how there are some soldiers that when the drill was over, they couldn't seem to turn it off, that they would keep stabbing the dummies, that they would keep on going and pushing. And he recognizes that for a lot of these soldiers, there's an intense darkness there. And I think he starts to recognize it later on in himself. These are men and women that seem to have, a lot of them, deep traumas, deep issues that they have to work through. And instead of giving them that support, the army sort of hones in on those things to try to train people into dehumanizing killing machines. 3 more, let's go! Harry talks about in the final parts of his training, they have to do an exercise called the long reach, which is like a super, super long walk slash run slash training exercise. They have to do this exercise in the pouring rain, and Harry gets trench foot. Don't Google it, okay? I did that. Don't do it. It's basically his feet were like so pruned that the skin started to peel off. He's examined by a medic, and a medic says, yeah, you're probably out of commission. Then a color sergeant comes to him and says, Mr. Wales, you've got one last push. You've literally got 6 or 8 miles left. That's it all. I know your feet are shit, but I suggest you don't quit. I know you can do this. You know you can do this. Push on. You'll never forgive yourself if you don't. And again, that's the fucking bullshit twisted logic that I hate that is part of military training. You do not have to push through a medical problem or pain that you're in. Fuck that. You don't have to put your body through anything like that. And I don't like that there's this sense of guilting people into doing things that push their body to the extreme limits. Harry says that he did it, but he does say that he was in agony doing this. But of course, the color sergeant gives him a little smile and walks away. Good job, son. Pushing their physical limitations and their bodies. Not for me. Finally, we get to passing out. His whole family comes to see him pass out of training. His granny is pretty excited about it because she hasn't been to one in decades. And William starts training at Sandhurst since he has now left St. Andrews. It's in this brief moment that Harry outranks William, the spare outranked heir. And I think we're going to see a little bit later that William doesn't like being in that kind of position. Harry is getting ready to head out to Iraq. He seems super excited to go. He's ready. He's prepared for this. He's trained for this. But of course, he feels still a little bit upset and guilty that he is going to be leaving Chelsea behind. But at this point, he's like, I gotta do this for myself. At the end of this chapter, Harry also details a sort of paranoia that him and William start to share as they start to see stories popping up in the papers that they're not sure how the papers could have gotten a hold of that information. He notes that one paper had run a story about William leaving a voicemail for him, pretending to be Chelsea, calling JLP to talk about some research or a project at Sandhurst where he was training. And he said both stories for once were true. The question was, how could the papers have known such deeply private things? Discussing it with William, they start to get paranoid about whether there's somebody in their inner circle that's leaking information, or friends that are sneaking in and getting information and confiding in the press. I mean, spoiler alert, but what actually is happening is that their
Phones are being hacked.
which is despicable. But we see how they truly start to like question all their inner circle of friends, are worried that they are doing something wrong, when in fact they're not doing anything wrong. They're being hacked illegally. And with that, Harry is willing to get the fuck out of the UK, go off to war, fight, be a hero. And with that, he ends part 1. We did it. We got to the end of part 1. Hopefully I'll get my thoughts out about the rest of the book. I finished the whole book, but I know that I can ramble on for a long time. So hope you enjoyed my thoughts on this. Please read Spare. It's an interesting read. There's a lot of details in here. It's well written. It's thoughtful. Go read it. Enjoy. Read it. Bye. Do it. Dude, you do. It's over. Go home. Go home. The movie's over.
Go home. Go.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Go home. The movie's over.